Welcome back. Tonight, we are looking at 11 true stories from a time when the world felt like it was shifting under our feet, the years 1990 and 1991. These are stories of trust, or the lack of it, told in the quiet hours when the house is still. You will hear the sound of rain and soft, white noise underneath my voice, so if you are listening late at night, just settle in. If you enjoy these strange, dark, and mysterious stories, hit the subscribe button now. And as for the like button, treat it like a stranger who offers to help you carry your heavy grocery bags to your door at 2 in the morning. You can smile, you can say thank you, and then you can firmly hit the like button instead of letting them inside your home. It is the safest way to show your appreciation. Now, turn the lights down low, get comfortable, listen to the rhythmic sound of the rain against the window, and let us ease into the first story of the night. August 24th, 1990, Gainesville, Florida. Sonia Larson and Christina Powell were busy moving their belongings into apartment 113 at the Christia Manor complex. The air was thick with the scent of cardboard boxes and floor cleaner, a smell that usually means a fresh start. Sonia was 18 years old, and Christina was 17. They had just arrived to begin their freshman year at the University of Florida, and the excitement was a physical presence. Sonia spent the afternoon carefully unrolling a poster of a sunset and taping it to her bedroom wall. She was a quiet girl from Pompano Beach, known for her bright smile and her habit of calling her mother every single evening just to check in. To her, this apartment was not just a place to sleep. It was her first taste of real independence. She moved with a sense of purpose, stacking her textbooks on a small wooden desk and wondering which of her new classmates would be her friends. Sonia had always been the dependable one in her family, the kind of person who remembered every birthday and sent handwritten notes for no reason. She had spent the summer working at a local pool, saving every dollar she could to make sure she wouldn't have to worry about money during her first semester. As she tucked her favorite quilt onto her new twin-sized bed, she felt a sense of peace. She was exactly where she had always dreamed of being, starting her life as a student. Christina was in the kitchen, organizing a small collection of mismatched mugs they had brought from home. She was the more outgoing of the two, a girl who loved music and could talk to anyone for hours. She had spent the last week packing and repacking her suitcase, making sure she had everything she needed for her new life as a Gator. Every time she looked out the window at the bustling campus nearby, she felt a surge of nervous energy that she channeled into putting away dishes. Christina had been a star student in high school, always involved in clubs and social events. She was the heart of her friend group, the person who made sure everyone was included and happy. Moving to Gainesville was a big step for her, but she was ready for the challenge. She had already mapped out the quickest route to her first class and picked out her outfit for Monday morning. To her, the future felt wide open, bright, and full of possibilities that she was eager to explore. The two roommates had known each other for years, and their parents were relieved they were living together. They were the kind of girls who looked out for one another, checking in if the other was late and sharing meals to save time. Their apartment was small, with beige walls and a sliding glass door that led out to a small concrete patio. It was basic, student-grade housing, but they had already filled it with small touches that made it feel like a home rather than a dormitory. That evening, the two roommates sat on their new sofa and shared a pizza, talking about their schedules for the coming week. They made plans to walk to the student union together and debated which coffee shop near the library had the best seating. The apartment felt warm and safe, a little sanctuary in a new city. They had checked the locks on the front door twice, a habit their parents had drilled into them, and they eventually turned off the lights, falling into a deep sleep. Somewhere in the middle of the night, a soft sound traveled through the apartment that did not belong. It was the mechanical click of a sliding glass door being lifted upward in its track. The sound was so faint it was easily swallowed by the hum of the air conditioner, but it changed the atmosphere of the room instantly. A shadow moved across the linoleum floor of the kitchen, pausing near the counter where the pizza box still sat. The person moving did not bump into furniture. The intruder stood in the hallway between the two bedrooms for a long time, just listening to the rhythmic breathing of the two girls. He moved with the practiced ease of someone who had done this many times before, someone who viewed a locked home not as a barrier, but as a challenge. He was not looking for jewelry or cash, and he did not reach for the electronics sitting on the coffee table. He was looking for something else, something that could be taken but never returned. On the morning of August 26th, a neighbor named Manuel was walking his dog past apartment 113. He noticed that the front door was standing open by about 3 inches. It was a hot, humid Sunday morning, and most students were either sleeping in or heading to the dining hall. Manuel waited for a few minutes, expecting one of the girls to come out with the trash or a laundry basket, but the door did not move. There was a strange silence from the hallway. Manuel knocked on the door and called out, but no one answered. He pushed the door open just a bit further, thinking perhaps the girls had gone out and forgotten to pull it shut. The first thing he noticed was the temperature. The air conditioner was working overtime, making the apartment feel like a refrigerator. The second thing he noticed was a backpack lying on the floor in the middle of the living room, its contents spilled out across the carpet. He stepped inside quickly. When the police arrived shortly after 10 in the morning, they walked into a scene that felt staged for maximum impact. They found Sonia and Christina in their respective rooms, but the environment around them had been altered. The killer had used a knife with surgical precision, and he had taken the time to arrange the scene in a way that suggested he wanted the discovery to be a theatrical event. There were no signs of a struggle near the door, suggesting they were caught unaware. The apartment was eerily quiet as the forensic team began their work. They noted that the sliding glass door at the back had been tampered with. The security bar moved aside with a piece of wire. On the kitchen counter, a small amount of food had been eaten from the pizza box, as if the intruder had sat and watched the apartment before acting. It was a level of coldness that the officers had rarely seen. The killer had not just committed a crime, he had made himself at home. One of the lead investigators stood in the doorway of Christina's room and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. On a bookshelf near the bed, a single object had been placed with careful intention, almost like a trophy on display. The level of organization and the lack of fingerprints at the entry point told the police they were not looking for a panicked student or a burglar who had made a mistake. They were looking for a predator who found pleasure in work. News of the double murder spread through Gainesville like a fever. Within 24 hours, another student, Krista Hoyt, was found in her apartment under similar, horrific circumstances. The university campus, which had been full of life just days before, became a ghost town. Students began sleeping in groups in the hallways of the student union, and the local hardware stores sold out of deadbolts and window locks within hours. The city was under a cloud of fear and tension. The investigation into Krista Hoyt's death confirmed the worst fears of the local police. She had been found in her apartment after failing to show up for her shift at the police department where she worked as a clerk. The staging of her body was even more elaborate than the first scene, indicating that the killer was becoming more confident and more dangerous. He was leaving a signature that was designed to shock the investigators and humiliate the victims in their death. By the third day, 2 more students, Tracy Pauls and Manny Tabawada, were found in their apartment at the Gatorwood complex. The pattern was the same, the entry was the same, and the lack of forensic evidence was the same. The police were working around the clock, but they had no solid leads. Every person with a criminal record in the county was being interviewed, and the FBI's behavioral science unit was called in to help build a profile of the man they were hunting. The police initially focused all their energy on a 28-year-old man named Edward Humphrey. He lived in the same neighborhood and was known to have a history of mental health struggles and aggressive behavior. He looked the part of a villain, with a scarred face and an erratic way of speaking. The media latched onto him, and for a short time, the public believed the monster had been caught. But the evidence did not fit, and the killings had been far too precise. Edward Humphrey was a convenient suspect because he was visible and he was different. He had been seen wandering the streets at odd hours and had a reputation for shouting at strangers. But as the detectives looked closer, they realized that Humphrey lacked the technical skill and the calm nerves required to bypass security systems and leave no trace behind. He was a man in pain, but he was not the ghost who was moving through the apartments of Gainesville that August. While the city was focused on the local suspect, a break came from a completely different direction. About 40 miles away, in the town of Ocala, a man had been arrested for a botched robbery at a grocery store. He had managed to flee the scene and hide in the woods, but the police had found his campsite. Inside a small nylon tent, they discovered a collection of items that did not belong to a simple thief. They found a money bag, a military-style knife, and cassette tapes. The campsite was located in a remote area, hidden by dense brush and pine trees. It was organized with a military level of cleanliness. There were multiple changes of clothes, all of them dark, and a set of tools that could be used for breaking and entering. The police in Ocala did not immediately connect this man to the Gainesville murders, but they knew they had someone unusual in their custody. They called the task force in Gainesville to see if there was any overlap. A detective sat in a quiet room and pressed play on a small tape recorder found in that tent. He expected to hear plans for a robbery or perhaps a confession. Instead, he heard the calm, melodic voice of a man singing folk songs. The singer talked about his childhood and his dreams, but then his tone shifted. He began to describe a dark persona that lived inside him, a presence he called the Gemini. The voice was chillingly rational, as if he were discussing the weather. The songs on the tape were interspersed with long monologues where the man talked about his desire for fame and his belief that he was destined for greatness. He spoke about his father, a police officer, with a mixture of fear and admiration. He seemed to be performing for an audience that did not yet exist, preparing himself for the moment he would be revealed to the world. The detective listening felt a deep sense of unease. This was the voice of the man from the apartments. Forensic teams began to process the items from the campsite, and the pieces finally started to click into place. DNA evidence from a discarded tool at the campsite matched the biological samples found at the Christia Manor apartments. The man in the tent was not a local student or a known resident of Gainesville. His name was Danny Rolling, a 36-year-old drifter from Louisiana who had been moving across the South, leaving a trail of quiet violence in his wake. Danny Rolling was brought into an interrogation room where he sat with his hands folded, looking more like a soft-spoken churchgoer than a serial killer. He did not yell, and he did not deny his presence in the city. He spoke about his life with a detached, almost poetic quality. He told the detectives that he had arrived in Gainesville with the intention of becoming a superstar of crime. He had watched the girls from the woods, waiting for the moment the world turned dark. Rolling had been a loner for most of his life, a man who felt rejected by society and overshadowed by his father's reputation. He had spent time in prison for various crimes, but he had never been caught for anything this violent. He viewed the Gainesville murders as his masterpiece, a way to ensure that his name would be remembered long after he was gone. He spoke about the victims not as people, but as characters in a story that he was writing with a sharp, heavy blade. During the long hours of questioning, Rolling eventually admitted to all 5 murders in Gainesville. He described how he would enter the apartments through the sliding doors, moving with the silence he had learned while hiding from his father as a child. He explained the staging of the bodies, admitting that he wanted to create a spectacle that people would never forget. He seemed to take a quiet pride in the fear he had caused, viewing the city's lockdown as an achievement. The investigation into Rolling's past revealed a cycle of abuse that had shaped his mind. His father had been a police officer who had treated his home like a precinct and his son like a criminal. Rolling had spent his life oscillating between a desire for approval and a deep, burning resentment for authority. He did not kill for money or for revenge against a specific person. He killed because he wanted to be the one in control, the one who decided when the music stopped. In 1994, Danny Rolling pleaded guilty to all charges. He was sentenced to death, a process that would take another 12 years to conclude. During his time on death row, he continued to draw and write, still obsessed with the idea of his own legacy. He never showed true remorse for the lives of the young women he had ended, focusing instead on the theatrical nature of his crimes and the influence they had on the culture of the city where he was finally caught. In this present year of 2026, Danny Rolling has been dead for 20 years, having been executed by lethal injection in 2006. His name is still used in forensic psychology classes to teach the concept of crime scene staging and the signatures of a narcissistic killer. Cold case units across the country continue to use his DNA to check against unsolved murders from the 1980s, ensuring that no other secrets remain hidden in the shadow of his memory. The fear in Gainesville eventually faded, replaced by better locks and safer dormitories, but the memory of that August night remains. It is a reminder that the most ordinary setting, like a new apartment or a quiet bedroom, can be changed in an instant by a single, offbeat detail. In another part of the world, on a small island in the Pacific, a different kind of silence was about to settle over a village called Aramawana, where a man was standing on his porch, watching. November 13th, 1990. The seaside village of Aramawana, New Zealand. Gary Holden stood in his driveway, his hands dark with grease as he worked on the engine of his car. The air smelled of salt spray and blooming gorse, a heavy, sweet scent that defined the beginning of the southern summer. Aramawana was a place of total peace, a tiny collection of wooden cottages nestled between the steep, green hills and the cold, gray waters of the Pacific Ocean. Gary was a man who lived for the quiet rhythm of the coast. He was a devoted father to his two young daughters and a helpful neighbor who was always the first to offer a tool or a hand with a broken fence. On this Tuesday afternoon, he was enjoying the simple satisfaction of a mechanical task, listening to the sound of the waves hitting the white sand a few hundred yards away. To him, the village was the safest place on earth, a sanctuary for his family. He had spent years building a life that was centered around the outdoors, taking his girls on long walks along the cliffs and teaching them how to spot the yellow-eyed penguins that nested nearby. Gary was known for his easy laugh and his patience, the kind of man who didn't let the small stresses of life get to him. As he tightened a bolt on the alternator, he looked up and saw his neighbor, David Gray, standing on a nearby porch, watching him in total silence. David Gray was a man the village had learned to look past. He was an unemployed house painter who lived alone in a small, cluttered shack filled with old newspapers and military magazines. He was a thin, balding man who rarely spoke to anyone, usually keeping his head down as he walked to the local store. The people of Aramawana viewed him as eccentric but harmless, a lonely soul who simply preferred the company of his own thoughts and his collection of books. Gary gave a quick, friendly wave to David, a gesture he had made dozens of times before. Usually, David would look away or give a short, stiff nod. But today was different. David did not move. He stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on Gary with a cold, unblinking intensity that made the hair on the back of Gary's neck stand up. There was no anger on David's face, only a strange, hollow emptiness that seemed to swallow the afternoon sun. The tension in the air shifted when David's dog, a small, wandering terrier, trotted across the property line into Gary's yard. It was a minor thing, something that happened every week. But as Gary leaned down to pat the dog, David suddenly spoke. His voice was low and jagged, accusing Gary of trying to steal his only friend. The accusation was so sudden and so bizarre that Gary froze, unsure if he should laugh or apologize for the imaginary slight. Gary tried to de-escalate the situation, speaking in the calm, measured tone he used with his children. He told David that he was just being friendly, that the dog was fine, and that there was no reason to be upset. But the more Gary spoke, the more David's face contorted. It wasn't just about the dog anymore. David began to rant about respect, about how the village looked down on him, and how he was tired of being treated like a ghost in his own home. Without another word, David turned and walked back into his house, slamming the heavy wooden door behind him. Gary stood in his driveway for a moment, the grease still wet on his fingers, feeling a deep sense of unease. He decided it was time to head inside and check on his daughters. He wiped his hands on a rag and turned toward his front door, but he never made it to the handle. A sharp, metallic crack shattered the silence of the afternoon. The sound was so loud it didn't seem real, a physical force that tore through the air. Gary felt a sudden, hot bloom of pain in his chest that knocked the breath out of him. He stumbled back against his car, his eyes wide with confusion. He looked toward David's house and saw a small puff of gray smoke drifting away from a window on the second floor. The peaceful village had suddenly become a place where the air itself was a weapon. Inside Gary's house, his daughter Chiquita heard the noise and ran to the window. She saw her father slumped against the car and thought at first that the engine had exploded. She started to run toward the door to help him, but then she saw David Gray step out onto his porch. He wasn't carrying a paintbrush or a book. He was holding a semi-automatic rifle with a telescopic sight, and he was moving with a slow, mechanical precision. Chiquita scrambled under a heavy wooden table in the dining room, her heart hammering against her ribs. She watched through the legs of the table as David walked calmly down his front steps. He didn't look like the shy neighbor she had known her entire life. He looked like a soldier on a mission. He walked toward her father and fired again, his expression as blank as a stone. Then, he turned his attention toward the other houses on the small, quiet street. For the next 22 hours, the village of Aramoana became a kill zone. David Gray moved through the grass and the trees like a predator, shooting at anything that moved. He targeted neighbors he had known for decades, people who had invited him for tea and helped him with his groceries. He set fire to Gary's house, the smoke rising into the darkening sky as a signal to the rest of the world that something had gone terribly wrong in the sanctuary. The local police were the first to arrive, but they were completely outmatched. The first officer on the scene, Sergeant Stuart Guthrie, tried to talk David down, using his years of training in community policing. He crawled through the brush, calling out David's name, trying to reach the man behind the rifle, but David was gone. He answered the sergeant's voice with a burst of gunfire, killing the man who had only wanted to bring him back to reality. The sun went down, and the village was plunged into a terrifying, pitch-black darkness. The only light came from the smoldering ruins of the houses David had set on fire. The residents who were still alive hid in cellars, under beds, and in the thick scrub of the hills, listening to the occasional pop of a rifle and the sound of David's heavy boots on the gravel. He was playing a game of hide-and-seek where the prize was another minute of life. The elite anti-terrorist squad arrived from the city in the middle of the night, but they found themselves pinned down. David knew the terrain of the village perfectly. He knew every shortcut, every hidden path, and every blind spot. He used the scoped rifle to keep the officers at a distance, firing from the shadows and then vanishing before they could return fire. He was a ghost in a military jacket, haunting the streets he had walked for years. When the sun rose on Wednesday morning, a thick fog rolled in from the Pacific, covering the village in a gray shroud. The officers moved in a tight formation, their eyes scanning the windows and the rooftops. They eventually tracked David to a small shed near the edge of the water. There was a final, brief exchange of gunfire, and the man who had terrorized his neighbors for nearly a day was finally brought down by a team of marksmen. The silence that followed was heavy and unnatural. As the officers moved through the village, they found the scale of the tragedy was far worse than they had imagined. 13 people were dead, including children and the brave sergeant who had tried to save them. The houses were riddled with bullet holes, and the smell of smoke and salt lingered in the air. The small community had been shattered by a man who felt he had nothing left to lose. The investigation into David Gray's life revealed a man who had become obsessed with survivalist culture and military hardware. His house was found to be a labyrinth of ammunition crates and instructional manuals on guerrilla warfare. He had been practicing his aim on targets in the woods for months, a detail that everyone had heard but no one had questioned. They thought he was just a lonely man with a hobby, not a man building a private war. The Aramoana massacre changed New Zealand forever. Within weeks, the government began the process of tightening the nation's gun laws, specifically targeting the type of semi-automatic weapons David had used. The tragedy forced a conversation about mental health and the dangers of social isolation in small towns. The village, once known for its penguins and its peace, became a symbol of how quickly a normal life can be undone by a single, dark obsession. Reaching the quiet of 2026, the village of Aramoana remains a quiet, somber place. A small monument stands near the shore, listing the names of the 13 victims who lost their lives on that Tuesday afternoon. It is a place of pilgrimage for those who remember the day the sanctuary was broken. The memory of Gary Holden and the others is preserved in the silence of the waves, a lingering aftertaste of a beauty that was once interrupted by a cold, gray smoke. The wooden houses of Aramoana still stand against the Pacific wind, their windows looking out over a sea that never changes. But the sense of safety that once defined the coast has shifted, moving across the ocean to the humid, gated suburbs of Manila, where a different kind of house was about to be visited by a different kind of shadow. June 30th, 1991. Parañaque, Philippines. Estrellita Vizconde sat in her living room, enjoying the cool air from the electric fan. It was a humid night in the suburbs of Manila, and the house was quiet except for the low hum of the television in the background. She was a woman who took great pride in her home, a spacious 2-story house in a gated community called Brookside Hills. It was supposed to be a safe place for her family. Estrellita was 47 years old and spent most of her time managing the household while her husband, Loro, worked overseas. Loro was a cook on a luxury cruise ship, earning a good living to provide for his family back in the Philippines. They were a middle-class success story, having moved into this beautiful neighborhood to give their children a better life. Estrellita took her role as the anchor of the family seriously and kept the house spotless for them. Her eldest daughter, Carmela, was 19 years old and a student at a local university. She was a bright, popular girl with a wide circle of friends and a promising future ahead of her. Carmela was the kind of daughter who shared everything with her mother, and the two of them often spent their evenings talking about school and boys. She was the light of the house, always humming a tune or planning her next social outing with her many college classmates and friends. The youngest daughter, Jennifer, was only 7 years old and was the baby of the family. She was a playful child who loved her toys and her older sister more than anything else. Jennifer followed Carmela around like a shadow, imitating her style, her walk, and her laugh. The Vizconde home was often filled with the sounds of their bickering and their affection, a normal, happy environment that Estrellita guarded with every ounce of her maternal strength each day. That specific evening had been very ordinary for the three women. They had eaten a simple dinner together and cleaned up the kitchen, chatting about the coming week. Estrellita had checked the locks on the heavy iron front gate and the wooden front door, a routine she never missed. Living in a gated community provided a sense of security that she valued deeply. She liked the feeling of being tucked away from the busy, noisy, and often dangerous streets of the city. Carmela had retreated to her bedroom to study, while Jennifer was already drifting off to sleep in her own bed. Estrelita usually stayed up a bit later than the girls, waiting for the house to fully settle before she went to bed herself. She often thought about Loro, imagining him on the other side of the world, working hard so they could have these quiet moments of peace. The distance was difficult, but the letters and the phone calls kept them close together. The house in Brookside Hills was more than just a building to Estrelita. It was a symbol of their family's resilience and hard work. Every piece of furniture and every framed photo on the wall represented a milestone they had reached together as a unit. She walked through the rooms with a sense of quiet satisfaction, adjusting a cushion here or a curtain there. Everything was in its place, and as the clock moved toward midnight, she prepared to retire for the night. On the morning of July 1st, a man named Gomez was walking past the Vizconde residence on his way to his job. He noticed something that felt slightly out of place for such a tidy and organized household. The front gate, which was usually kept firmly shut and padlocked by the family, was standing open by several inches. It was not swinging wide, but the gap was enough to see into the driveway. Gomez slowed his pace, wondering if they had simply forgotten to lock it. He stopped at the edge of the property and looked toward the house, shielded slightly by the morning shadows. The front door was also slightly ajar, which was even more unusual for that time of the morning in this neighborhood. There was no sound of movement from inside, no smell of breakfast cooking, and no sign of the family's pet dog. The morning air was still and humid, and a heavy silence seemed to hang over the driveway as Gomez stared at the dark entryway. A family relative who lived nearby arrived shortly after and decided to check on the house when she saw the open door. She pushed the front gate open and walked toward the porch, calling out Estrelita's name in a loud voice. When she stepped into the foyer, she was met with a sight that did not make sense in the context of their normal life. The living room was perfectly clean, but there was a faint, metallic smell in the air that made her heart race with fear. The relative moved toward the stairs, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps as the silence of the house grew heavier. She found the three women in their respective areas of the home, and the scene was unlike anything she had ever seen. The violence that had occurred was staggering, especially given that the home showed no signs of a struggle in the main living areas. It was as if the world had simply stopped for the family in the middle of a very normal night. The Parañaque police arrived and began the grim task of processing the crime scene. They found that the telephone lines had been cut from the outside of the house, a detail that suggested a high level of premeditation. The investigators moved through the rooms with flashlights, looking for any clue that might explain who could have committed such an act. They found a few bloody footprints on the marble floors, but the prints were smeared and very difficult to track. One of the most puzzling aspects of the case was the lack of a traditional motive. Nothing of value appeared to be missing from the house, and the jewelry and electronics were all where they belonged. This was not a robbery gone wrong, but something much more targeted and deliberate. The investigators noted that the front door had not been forced open, which suggested that the family might have known their visitors, or that the door had been left unlocked by mistake. News of the massacre hit the front pages of every major newspaper in the Philippines by the following afternoon. The public was horrified by the loss of a mother and her two young daughters in what was considered a secure neighborhood. Loro Vizconde received the news while he was still at sea, and the long journey back home was a nightmare of grief. He arrived to find his beautiful home turned into a crime scene, surrounded by yellow tape and flashing cameras. For the next several years, the case remained cold, despite the massive pressure from the public and the media. The police followed hundreds of different leads, but none of them led to a solid arrest or a clear suspect. There were constant rumors of high-profile involvement, with some suggesting that the killers were children of powerful politicians. However, No one was willing to go on the record, and the investigation seemed to stall in the face of absolute silence. Lauro Visconde became a fixture in the national media, a heartbroken father who refused to let the memory of his family fade into obscurity. He formed a group for the victims of violent crime, turning his personal tragedy into a crusade for legal reform. He spent his days at the police station and his nights in a house that felt too large and too quiet. He was a man driven by a single goal, and he would not rest until he had a name for the shadows in his house. In 1995, a woman named Jessica Alfaro came forward with a story that changed the entire direction of the case. She claimed to be a witness to the events of that night and identified a group of young men from some of the most prominent families in the country. Among them was Hubert Webb, the son of a famous senator and a well-known basketball star. Alfaro's testimony painted a dark picture of a drug-fueled party that had spiraled out of control. The trial of the Webb Group became the biggest legal event in the history of the Philippines. It was a clash between the grieving father and the untouchable elite of the city of Manila. Hubert Webb and his co-accused maintained their innocence, providing evidence that they were not even in the area at the time of the murders. However, the court found the testimony of Jessica Alfaro to be credible and detailed enough to form the basis of a criminal conviction. The courtroom was packed every single day as the details of the night were reconstructed through the eyes of the witness. Alfaro described how the men had entered the house and how the situation had turned violent almost immediately. The defense team attacked her character and her history, suggesting she was a paid informant with no real knowledge of the crime. Despite the lack of physical evidence linking the men to the scene, the pressure for a result was immense. In the year 2000, the judge issued a verdict that was heard around the country. Hubert Webb and his associates were found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. For many, it felt like a victory for the common man over the powerful elite who thought they were above the law. Lauro Visconde sat in the courtroom and wept, believing that he had fulfilled his promise to his wife and daughters. The men were led away in handcuffs to begin their terms in prison. The conviction felt like the end of the story, but the legal battle was actually far from over. For the next 10 years, the case moved through the appeals process, with the defense team challenging every piece of the prosecution's case. They focused heavily on the lack of DNA evidence and the many inconsistencies in Alfaro's testimony. The nation remained divided, with some seeing the men as monsters and others seeing them as victims of a flawed and biased legal system. During the long years of the appeal, the men remained in a high-security prison, away from the lives of luxury they had once known. Hubert Webb's father, the senator, continued to maintain his son's innocence, spending a fortune on legal fees and private investigators. The case became a symbol of the deep divisions in Philippine society, a story that would not go away. Meanwhile, Lauro Visconde continued to wait, his life still tethered to the cold walls of the courtroom. In 2010, the Supreme Court of the Philippines issued a final ruling that would change everything once again. They overturned the convictions of Hubert Webb and his associates, citing the failure of the state to prove their guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The court noted that the star witness's testimony was flawed, and that there was no physical evidence to link the men to the scene. After 15 years behind bars, the men were set free to return home. During this time, I often wondered how a person continues to breathe when their entire world has been erased in a single night. Lauro Visconde lived in a state of constant mourning, his life dedicated entirely to the courtrooms and the press conferences. He kept the rooms of his daughters exactly as they were, creating a museum of a life that had been stolen from him. The weight of his grief was something that the entire country felt whenever he appeared on the news. The ruling left the Visconde massacre officially unsolved, a mystery with no clear resolution. With the acquittal of the main suspects, there were no other leads for the police to follow. The original evidence from the crime scene, including the biological samples taken from Carmela, had been lost or destroyed by the National Bureau of Investigation years earlier. This meant that modern DNA testing, which might have provided a definitive answer, was completely impossible. The loss of the evidence was seen as a major failure of the investigative system. Without those samples, there was no way to prove or disprove the presence of the suspects at the house. The truth of that night in 1991 remained buried in the past, hidden by the passage of time and the errors of the authorities. The killers, whoever they were, had managed to evade the law through a combination of circumstances and the many failures of the state. The Webb Circle represented a specific segment of society, young men of privilege who moved through the world with a sense of absolute invincibility, whether they were guilty or not. The case exposed a deep-seated rot in the justice system, where evidence could vanish and powerful names could sway the course of history. The killers had operated with a cold efficiency that left almost no trail for the police to follow in the aftermath of that quiet suburban night. Lauro Vizconde was devastated by the Supreme Court's decision to release the men. He felt that the system had failed his wife and his daughters one final time. He continued to fight for a reopening of the case, but the legal principle of double jeopardy meant that the acquitted men could never be tried for the same crime again. He spent his remaining years as a man seeking a ghost, his health slowly declining under the immense pressure of his unfinished life task. By this point in 2026, Lauro Vizconde has been dead for 10 years, having passed away in 2016. He spent his final days in a quiet house, surrounded by the photos of the family he could never truly avenge. His health had been failing him for a long time, but his mind remained sharp, still replaying the events of that trial in his head. He died as he lived for 25 years, a man whose life was entirely defined by the terrible events of a single night. Hubert Webb, on the other hand, remains a free man in 2026 and has started a family of his own. He lives a quiet life, away from the cameras and the intense public scrutiny that once followed his every move. To some, he is a man who successfully reclaimed his life after a terrible mistake by the justice system. To others, he is a ghost who walked away from a crime that should have kept him behind bars forever. He does not speak about the case to anyone. The case of the Vizconde massacre is officially considered a cold case in 2026, and it remains the most famous example of a search for justice that ended in a vacuum. The house in Brookside Hills has long since been sold and renovated by new owners who have no connection to the past. The file sits in a dusty cabinet in a government office, a collection of papers and photos that can no longer speak for the 3 women who lost their lives in the house. Today, the names of Estrelita, Carmela, and Jennifer are still whispered in Parañaque whenever the conversation turns to the hidden dangers of the city. There are no new suspects, and the forensic technology of 2026 cannot fix the catastrophic mistakes made in 1991. The sense of closure that Lauro sought for so many decades never arrived, leaving a lingering void in the heart of the nation that witnessed the long, slow trial of the men. The cold marble floors of the Vizconde home, once stained with the loss of a family, are now clean and indifferent to the past. But that same coldness can be found in a different place, where a wealthy woman in France was about to use her last moments of strength to leave a message. It was a message that would spark a different kind of debate, centered not on who was powerful, but on the simple grammar of a single blood-written sentence inside a dark cellar. June 23, 1991. Mougins, France. Ghislaine Marchal walked through the gardens of her villa, La Chamade, carrying a pair of pruning shears. The sun was warm on the white stone of the house, and the scent of blooming jasmine filled the air. Ghislaine was 65 years old, a wealthy widow who valued her privacy and her meticulously kept grounds. It was a perfect Sunday morning on the French Riviera, the kind of day that felt like it would never end. Ghislaine lived a life of quiet luxury, surrounded by beautiful things. She was a woman of high social standing, the daughter of an industrialist and the widow of a successful businessman. Her home was a sanctuary, filled with fine art and expensive furniture. She moved through her days with a refined elegance, sticking to a strict schedule that allowed her to maintain her independence while staying connected to her close circle of friends and family members. She was known for her sharp mind and her perfect command of the French language. Ghislaine had received an elite education, and she was the kind of person who would notice a misplaced comma in a letter or a slight mispronunciation in a conversation. To her, language was a reflection of one's character and upbringing. She spent a lot of her time writing letters to her friends, her handwriting always fluid and precise, reflecting her disciplined and orderly nature. In the afternoons, Ghislaine often sat on her terrace with a book, looking out over the hills of Mougins. She was not a lonely woman, but she enjoyed the solitude that her wealth allowed her. She had a small staff that helped her maintain the villa, including a gardener who had been with her for several years. She trusted the people who worked for her, and she expected them to be as professional and as disciplined as she was in her own daily life and her social duties. Omar Radad was her gardener, a 30-year-old man from Morocco who spoke very little French. He was a quiet, hard-working man who lived in a nearby town with his wife and children. Omar spent his days trimming the hedges and tending to the flowers, moving through the gardens with a sense of quiet dedication. He was grateful for the job, as it allowed him to provide for his young family, and he always treated Ghislaine with the utmost respect and silent politeness. The relationship between the employer and the gardener was purely professional. Ghislaine would give him his instructions for the day, and Omar would carry them out without complaint. He was a man of few words, partly because of the language barrier, and partly because of his naturally reserved personality. To Ghislaine, he was a reliable part of the villa's operation, a man who kept the grounds looking perfect for her many guests and her own quiet, solitary enjoyment. On that Sunday in June, Ghislaine had a simple lunch of salad and fruit. She had told her friends that she was looking forward to a quiet week of gardening and reading. She spent the afternoon working in the soil, her hands protected by leather gloves. As the sun began to set over the Mediterranean, she headed inside to prepare for the night. The villa was quiet, the only sound being the distant chirping of crickets in the tall grass and the wind in the olive trees. Monday morning arrived, but the shutters of La Chimade remained closed. Ghislaine had been expected for lunch with a group of friends in the village, but she never showed up. This was highly unusual for a woman who was famous for her punctuality. Her friends called the house multiple times, but the phone just rang and rang in the empty hallway. By Monday evening, they were worried enough to call the local police and ask them to check on the welfare of the widow. When the officers arrived at the villa, they found the gates locked and the house dark. They walked around the perimeter, looking for any sign of a break-in, but everything appeared to be in order. The cars were in the garage, and there was no sign of a struggle in the garden. They eventually found a side door that was unlocked and entered the house with their flashlights drawn. The air inside was cool and still, and the house felt strangely empty and abandoned. They searched the main living areas first, finding nothing out of the ordinary. The kitchen was clean, and the beds were made. It wasn't until they moved toward the basement that they noticed something strange. The door leading to the wine cellar was blocked from the inside. It took several strong pushes for the officers to force the door open, as if something heavy had been placed against it. The air that escaped from the cellar was damp and carried a faint, sweet smell. Inside the dark cellar, the police found Ghislaine Marchal. She was lying on the cold floor, her body showing signs of a violent attack. The room was small and cramped, filled with racks of dusty wine bottles. It was a place where she would have gone to fetch a bottle for dinner, far away from the bright sun and the beautiful gardens she loved so much. The officers moved closer, their flashlights illuminating a message that had been written on the white cellar door. Written in what appeared to be blood were the words, Omar Matur. The letters were large and shaky, as if they had been written with a finger in a moment of extreme physical distress. Below the first sentence, the same message was repeated partially, Omar Ma. The sight of the message was chilling, a dying declaration that pointed directly at the gardener. The police immediately secured the scene and called for the forensic team to begin their investigation. Omar Radad was arrested at his home the following morning. He was confused and frightened, unable to understand why the police were taking him away in front of his neighbors. He repeatedly told the officers in his broken French that he had done nothing wrong and that he respected Madame Marchal. But the evidence on the cellar door was hard to ignore. To the investigators, it seemed like a clear-cut case of a victim identifying her killer with her final breath. The investigation focused heavily on the relationship between Ghislaine and Omar. The police looked for a motive, suggesting that Omar might have been angry about his wages or that he had been caught stealing. They found that Omar had a small gambling habit, which they used to build a profile of a man in financial trouble. But there was no physical evidence linking him to the scene. No blood was found on his clothes, and no fingerprints belonging to him were in the cellar. As I looked at the photos of the cellar door, I noticed the specific way the letter R was formed at the end of the word tour. It was a sharp, downward stroke that felt hurried, as if the writer was running out of time or strength. It is a small detail, but it stands out against the white paint of the door. It is the kind of detail that makes you wonder about the exact moment the blood hit the surface and what was going through the mind of the person who put it there. The case quickly became a national obsession in France, centered entirely on the grammar of the blood-written message. Experts pointed out that the sentence Omar Matur contained a glaring error. In French, the past participle of a verb ending in should be used after the auxiliary verb. A well-educated woman like Ghislaine Marchal would have written Omar Matue. The mistake was seen by many as a sign that she had not written the message at all. The debate over the grammar became a proxy for a much larger discussion about class and race in France. Supporters of Omar argued that a sophisticated socialite would never make such a basic mistake, even in her dying moments. They suggested that the real killer had written the message to frame the gardener, assuming that a man with poor French skills would be an easy target for the police. The grammar mistake was, to them, proof of a clumsy and racist frame-up. The trial began in 1994, and the courtroom was a battlefield of linguistic experts and forensic scientists. Omar sat in the dock, looking small and overwhelmed by the legal machinery around him. He was represented by Jacques Vergès, a famous lawyer known for taking on impossible cases. Vergès argued that the evidence was too thin to convict, and that the message on the door was a fabrication designed to satisfy the public's desire for a quick arrest. The prosecution relied almost entirely on the blood message. They argued that in a moment of extreme pain and terror, even a well-educated person might forget the rules of grammar. They showed photos of the cellar and pointed to the fact that the door was blocked from the inside, suggesting that Ghislaine had locked herself in to escape her attacker and spent her final minutes naming him. To the jury, the visual impact of the bloody letters was more powerful than the grammar. Despite the lack of DNA evidence or witnesses, Omar Radad was found guilty and sentenced to 18 years in prison. The verdict sent shockwaves through France, leading to protests and accusations of a miscarriage of justice. Omar continued to maintain his innocence from his prison cell, his case becoming a cause célèbre for human rights groups and celebrities alike. The shadow of doubt hung over the conviction, refusing to disappear even as the years began to pass. In 1996, President Jacques Chirac granted Omar a partial pardon, reducing his sentence and allowing him to be released from prison 2 years later. However, the conviction was not overturned. Omar was a free man, but in the eyes of the law, he was still a killer. He spent the next several decades fighting to clear his name, requesting new DNA tests, and pushing for a retrial that would prove once and for all that he had been framed by the real killer. The mystery of who actually killed Ghislaine Marchal remained unsolved. If Omar didn't do it, then a killer had managed to enter the villa, commit a violent act, and write a message in the victim's blood without leaving a single trace of their own presence. Some suggested it was a botched robbery, while others pointed to people in Ghislaine's own social circle who might have had a motive to see her gone. But without evidence, these theories remain nothing more than whispers. Now, within the unfolding reality of 2026, Omar Radad is still fighting for total exoneration. His case has become one of the most famous examples of a disputed conviction in French history. New forensic technology has allowed for more detailed testing of the DNA found at the scene, and in recent years, investigators have identified the biological profiles of 4 unknown men on the cellar door. This discovery has breathed new life into the case and the push for a full retrial. The message Omar Matour remains on the door of the villa, though the house has long since changed hands. It is a haunting piece of evidence that continues to challenge the French justice system. The debate over those 3 words, and the missing letter E, is still taught in schools and discussed in law books as a warning about the power of a single detail. The truth of what happened in that cellar in 1991 is still hidden behind a layer of dried blood. Ghislaine Marchal's villa, La Chamade, sits quietly in the hills of Mougins, its white walls and beautiful gardens a stark contrast to the darkness of its basement. The memory of the refined widow and her gardener is forever linked by a grammatical error that changed the course of a man's life. It is a story of how a person's identity can be reshaped by the way someone else writes their name, leaving an aftertaste of a justice system that might have looked the wrong way. The unknown killer likely knew the layout of the house and the habits of its owner, choosing a victim and a scapegoat with a cold, calculated precision. They operated in the gaps between what the police expected and what the evidence actually showed. This kind of calculated ego, the need to be seen as superior to the law, was a trait shared by another man who was currently moving through the literary circles of Vienna, wearing a white suit and a very charming smile. May 23, 1990, Kremsen der Donau, Austria. Jack Unterweger stood at the heavy iron gates of Stein prison, waiting for the final, metallic click of the lock. He was 40 years old, dressed in a sharp, expensive suit that he had ordered from a tailor while still inside his cell. The spring air was cool and smelled of damp stone, but he did not shiver. He looked out at the rolling hills of the Wachau Valley and smiled at the small crowd of journalists and intellectuals who had gathered to welcome him back to the world. Jack had spent the last 15 years behind bars for the 1974 murder of a young woman, but he was not leaving as a forgotten convict. During his time in prison, he had become a literary sensation, writing an autobiography titled Purgatory that had captivated the Austrian elite. He was seen as the ultimate example of rehabilitation, a man who had traded his violent past for a typewriter and a soul-searching prose. To the professors and writers who championed his release, Jack was a genius who had simply lost his way. He moved into a stylish apartment in Vienna and quickly became a fixture of the city's high society. Jack was a man of small stature but immense charisma, always seen in white suits with a matching silk scarf draped around his neck. He spoke with a soft, refined accent and spent his evenings at the theater or in crowded cafes, surrounded by admirers who wanted to hear his thoughts on art and morality. He was no longer a killer in their eyes. He was a celebrity intellectual who had survived the darkness of the system. Jack's daily life was a whirlwind of interviews and public appearances. He was hired as a journalist for the national broadcaster, where he reported on social issues and the lives of the marginalized. He was particularly interested in the stories of women working in the city's red light districts, claiming that he wanted to use his platform to give them a voice. He moved through the dimly lit streets of Vienna with a press pass in his pocket and a notebook in his hand, a man of the people who was welcomed into every corner of the city. The Austrian public was enamored with his transformation. He was a frequent guest on talk shows, where he spoke eloquently about the power of literature to save a person from their own worst impulses. He lived a life of luxury that few could afford, funded by his book royalties and his steady work as a reporter. Every detail of his existence was carefully curated, from the way he polished his shoes to the specific, intricate knot he used to tie his silk cravats. He was a man who understood the importance of a perfect image. Despite his newfound fame, Jack remained a man of deep secrets. He often worked late into the night, claiming to be absorbed in his next big writing project. He told his friends that he needed the silence of the early morning hours to truly connect with his creative spirit. He was seen driving his bright red Ford Mustang through the deserted streets of Vienna long after the cafes had closed, the engine a low growl in the quiet night. He seemed to be a man who never slept, always searching for the next piece of inspiration. He maintained a very professional relationship with his editors, who praised his ability to find a story where others saw nothing. Jack had a knack for getting people to open up to him, using his past as a bridge to build trust with those who were usually suspicious of the media. He was a man who knew how to listen, or at least how to appear as if he were listening. To the world, he was a man who had fully embraced his second act, a man who was dedicated to making amends for the one terrible mistake of his youth. In the autumn of 1990, Jack traveled to Prague on a reporting assignment. Shortly after his arrival, a young woman named Blanka Bakova was found dead in a park. She had been strangled with her own undergarments, which were tied in a very specific, complicated knot. The local police were baffled, as there were no signs of a struggle and no witnesses. Jack was one of the first journalists on the scene, taking detailed notes and interviewing the lead investigators with a calm, professional interest. Returning to Vienna, Jack continued his work, but a string of similar murders began to occur in the woods surrounding Graz and the streets of the capital. The victims were all women who worked in the same districts Jack had been frequenting for his articles. The police noticed a pattern. Each woman had been strangled with a piece of her own clothing, and the knot used was a variation of a ligature they had only seen once before. It was a detail that was kept from the public, a secret known only to the forensic experts. If you were walking through Vienna in the winter of 1991, you might have seen Jack sitting in a cafe, reading the news of these crimes with a look of concerned empathy. I've often wondered how it feels to sit beside someone who is secretly relishing the chaos they have created, watching as the city begins to lock its doors. Jack was a master of the double life, playing the role of the concerned citizen while carrying the weight of his own dark impulses in the pocket of his white jacket. In the summer of 1991, Jack convinced his editors to send him to Los Angeles to write about the differences between American and European police work. He checked into the Cecil Hotel, a place already known for its dark history, and spent his nights riding along with the Los Angeles Police Department. He watched as they patrolled the streets of Skid Row, taking photos and asking pointed questions about how they handled cases involving the city's most vulnerable residents. He was a man at the height of his career. While Jack was in Los Angeles, 3 women were found dead in the city, their bodies discovered in remote areas. They had all been strangled in the same manner as the victims back in Austria. The Los Angeles detectives were impressed by Jack's knowledge of criminal psychology, and they allowed him access to the crime scenes. He stood among the officers, looking down at the evidence with a clinical gaze, all while preparing his next article about the failure of the American justice system to protect its citizens. The investigation in Austria had finally begun to focus on the literary star, A young detective named August Schenner started looking into Jack's travel records and realized that every time a murder occurred, Jack was in the vicinity. Schenner began a quiet search of Jack's past, going back to the original 1974 murder file. He looked at the old crime scene photos and noticed a detail that had been overlooked for years. The knot used on the woman in the woods years ago was identical to the knots being used today. The realization was a shock to the Austrian establishment. The intellectuals who had fought for Jack's release refused to believe that their protege could be responsible for such horror. They argued that it was a conspiracy by the police to punish a man who had successfully challenged the system. But the forensic evidence was mounting. The specific, intricate ligature knot was a signature that Jack could not help but leave behind. It was his way of claiming credit for his work, an intellectual's arrogant mark on the world of violence. In early 1992, the Austrian police issued a warrant for Jack's arrest. He received a tip that they were coming for him and fled across the Atlantic with his girlfriend. He moved from city to city, using his charm to find temporary shelter, but the international manhunt was closing in. He was no longer the dandy of Vienna. He was a fugitive whose face was on every news broadcast in the world. He was caught in Miami after a high-speed chase, still wearing a white suit that had become stained and wrinkled. During his extradition and the subsequent trial in Vienna, Jack remained defiant. He treated the courtroom like a stage, delivering long, dramatic speeches about his innocence and the cruelty of the state. He claimed that the police had planted evidence to destroy his reputation. He maintained his refined, intellectual persona, even as the families of the victims sat only a few feet away. He seemed to believe that if he could just find the right words, he could convince the world once again that he was the hero of the story. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, including DNA samples and the damning testimony of the knots. They argued that Jack was a malignant narcissist who viewed murder as an extension of his art. He didn't just kill, he used the victims to create a narrative where he was the central figure. His release from prison had not been a victory for rehabilitation, but a failure of a system that had allowed charisma to override common sense. The trial lasted for months, captivating the entire nation of Austria. In June 1994, a jury found Jack Unterweger guilty of 9 murders. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he was led away from the courtroom, he showed no emotion, his face a mask of cold indifference. He had lost the audience he had spent his life cultivating, and the white suits were replaced by the heavy denim of a prisoner once again. The literary star had finally run out of pages, and the truth of his nature was laid bare for all to see. Only a few hours after the verdict was delivered, a guard found Jack in his cell. He had used the drawstring from his prison trousers and the cord from his light fixture to create a ligature. He had tied a single, intricate knot, the same one he had used on his victims. He was dead at the age of 43. By taking his own life before the appeals process could begin, his conviction was technically vacated under Austrian law, meaning he died an innocent man in the eyes of the state. Looking back from a 2026 perspective, Jack Unterweger's case is a cornerstone of modern criminology. It is used as a primary warning against the dangers of celebrity parole and the way that intellectual arrogance can blind experts to the signs of a predator. His books have mostly fallen out of print, their prose now viewed through the lens of the violence he committed. In the halls of justice in Vienna, his name is spoken as a reminder that a man can change his clothes and his words, but the darkness within remains the same. The silk of his ties and the pages of his books are now just artifacts in a police archive, gathering dust alongside the evidence of his crimes. The ego that drove him to seek fame through blood eventually consumed him, leaving only the aftertaste of a life wasted on a hollow pursuit of greatness. This same cold, calculated need for control could be found in the dry, sun-bleached hills of Spain, where two brothers were about to settle an old score with a bag of sandwiches and a pair of shotguns. August 26th, 1990, Puerto Jaraco, Spain. Antonia and Encarnacion Cabanillas were playing a game of tag on the dusty main street as the sun began to dip behind the dry hills. The air was thick with the scent of sun-baked earth and the dry, golden grass that covered the surrounding Extremadura countryside. The sisters were only 14 and 12 years old, full of the restless energy that comes with the end of a long, hot summer break. The village of Puerto Jaraco was a tiny, isolated cluster of whitewashed houses where everyone knew everyone else's business. It was a place where time seemed to move slower, governed by the cycles of the harvest and the heat of the afternoon sun. But beneath the quiet surface, a dark history had been simmering for decades. A bitter feud between two families, the Izquierdos and the Cabanillas, had divided the town since the 1960s. Antonia was a girl who loved the simple rhythms of village life, often helping her mother with the laundry or walking to the small store for supplies. She was protective of her younger sister, Encarnacion, and the two were rarely seen apart. They lived in a world where the stories of the old feud were like ghost stories, told by the elders but feeling distant to children who just wanted to play. To them, the dusty road was a playground, not a battlefield for an old grudge. The feud had started over a small strip of land, a boundary dispute that had escalated into a cycle of violence over 30 years. In 1967, a fire had broken out in the Izquierdo family home, killing the matriarch of the clan. The Izquierdo children, especially the two brothers Emilio and Antonio, grew up believing the Cabanillas family had set the fire on purpose. They carried this belief like a heavy stone, letting it harden their hearts as the years passed by. Emilio and Antonio Izquierdo lived in a neighboring town, but their minds were always back in Puerto Jaraco. They were men of few words, often seen wearing dark, heavy clothing even when the weather was warm. They had spent their lives listening to their sisters, Luciana and Angela, recount the details of the fire and the perceived insults from the Cabanillas. The sisters were the ones who kept the fire of the grudge burning, reminding the brothers of their duty to their mother. The Izquierdo brothers lived a hermetic existence, avoiding the modern world and focusing entirely on their farm and their sense of family honor. They were skilled hunters, comfortable with the weight of a shotgun and the patience required to wait for a target. To them, the people of Puerto Jaraco were not just neighbors. They were representatives of a history that had stolen their mother and their peace. They moved through their days with a cold, focused energy that few understood. On this specific Sunday, the heat was particularly heavy, and most of the villagers were sitting outside their homes to catch the evening breeze. It was the paseo, a traditional time for socializing and enjoying the end of the day. Old men sat on wooden benches, and families stood in small groups, chatting about the upcoming harvest. The atmosphere was peaceful, a typical scene of rural Spanish life that had remained unchanged for generations in the quiet valley. Antonia and Encarnacion were laughing as they ran past the village fountain, their footsteps light on the stones. They didn't notice the dark car that pulled up at the entrance of the village, its engine idling for a moment before turning off. They didn't see the two men who stepped out, each carrying a double-barreled shotgun. The men were dressed in heavy hunting jackets and caps, despite the August heat, looking like they were prepared for a long night in the brush. Emilio and Antonio walked toward the center of the street, moving with a synchronized, steady pace. They did not look for specific people. They looked at the village as a whole. To them, the entire town was complicit in the old fire and the years of perceived disrespect. They reached the area where the most people were gathered and stopped. The sound of the children's laughter was the only thing filling the air as the two brothers raised their weapons to their shoulders. The first shotgun blast was a physical shock, the sound echoing off the white walls of the houses and shattering the evening peace. It was followed instantly by a second and then a third. People didn't run at first because they couldn't understand what was happening. They thought perhaps a car had backfired or someone was setting off celebratory fireworks. But then the screaming started, and the dusty street began to fill with the smell of gunpowder and the panic of the crowd. Antonia and Encarnacion were among the first to fall. They were caught in the open, with no place to hide from the spray of the heavy hunting rounds. The brothers continued to fire, reloading their shotguns with practiced hands and moving further into the village square. They were not shouting or showing anger. They were clinical and systematic. They fired at anyone who crossed their path, including elderly neighbors and people who had nothing to do with the original feud. A man named Antonio, a local resident, watched from his doorway as the brothers moved past. He saw the coldness in their eyes, a look of absolute certainty that was more terrifying than any expression of rage. He realized that they weren't looking for a fight. They were performing a task they had been preparing for their entire lives. He pulled his own children inside and bolted the door, listening to the heavy thud of the shotguns continuing outside in the darkening street. The massacre lasted only a few minutes, but it felt like hours to the people trapped in the square. 9 people were killed in the initial surge, and a dozen more were wounded as they tried to scramble for cover behind stone walls or parked cars. Once their ammunition was nearly gone, the Izquierdo brothers turned around and walked back toward their car. They moved just as calmly as they had arrived, their dark jackets blending into the shadows of the evening as they drove away. The local civil guard arrived within the hour, but the village was already a scene of total devastation. The medical teams worked by the light of flashlights, trying to help the wounded while the survivors sat on the ground in a state of shock. The silence that had returned to Puerto Jaraco was heavy and suffocating. The investigators noted that the brothers had used high-powered hunting loads, the kind designed to take down large game, ensuring that few would survive a hit. I noticed a detail in the police report about the items the brothers carried as they fled into the hills. Along with their shotguns, they had packed a simple plastic bag filled with ham sandwiches and a bottle of water. It was a strange, domestic detail for men who had just committed a massacre. They expected to be hungry as they waited for the sun to rise, as if they were going on a routine hunting trip rather than a flight from justice. It was a sign of their total detachment. The search for Emilio and Antonio took the police into the rugged olive groves and rocky hills that surrounded the village. The brothers knew the terrain perfectly, and they managed to evade the search teams throughout the night. They found a high point where they could watch the lights of the police cars moving through the valley below. They ate their sandwiches and waited, showing no sign of panic or regret for the lives they had ended just a few miles away in the square. Back in the village, the investigation began to look at the Izquierdo sisters, Luciana and Angela. The police found that the sisters had been seen talking to the brothers just before they left for Puerto Jaraco. It was suspected that the sisters had spent the day goading the men, telling them that the Cabanillas were laughing at their family and that the fire of 1967 would never be avenged unless they acted now. The sisters were the architects of the hate. The psychological profile of the brothers revealed a state of shared delusion where the memory of their mother's death had become the only thing that mattered. They didn't view their victims as individuals with their own lives and dreams. They saw them as symbols of a debt that had to be paid in blood. This kind of narrow, ancestral focus is common in isolated rural areas where family honor is placed above the law, creating a private world where violence feels like a duty. As the sun rose on Monday morning, a civil guard unit spotted the 2 brothers resting under an olive tree. They were surrounded quickly, and to the surprise of the officers, they did not attempt to fire their weapons or resist. They stood up and held out their hands to be cuffed, their expressions still blank and indifferent. When asked why they had done it, one of the brothers simply said that they had done what they had to do and that they could now sleep in peace. The trial of the Izquierdo brothers was a somber event that gripped all of Spain. It brought to light the dark reality of rural feuds that many people thought had disappeared in the modern era. The brothers were sentenced to nearly 700 years in prison, a symbolic number that reflected the scale of their crime. They were separated and sent to different high-security facilities, where they remained for the rest of their lives, never once asking for forgiveness or expressing remorse. The sisters, Luciana and Angela, were also investigated, but there was not enough evidence to prove they had directly ordered the killings. They were eventually moved to a mental health facility, where they spent their final years in isolation. The village of Puerto Juraco became a name synonymous with the Black Spain, the violent and superstitious history of the countryside. The feud had finally ended, but it had taken almost an entire generation of the village with it. Both Emilio and Antonio Izquierdo are dead, having passed away in prison by 2006. They died as they had lived, quiet and solitary men who never broke their silence about the details of that night. The sisters are also gone, leaving no one left from the original Izquierdo household to carry on the grudge. The family line ended in the cold, gray walls of state institutions, far away from the sun-bleached hills of their home in Extremadura. Today, under the 2026 sun, the village of Puerto Juraco is a peaceful, quiet place once again. The whitewashed houses have been repainted, and the dusty street where Antonia and Encarnacion once played is now paved and tidy. But the elders still remember the sound of the shotguns and the smell of the gunpowder in the August heat. They tell the story not as a warning about land, but as a warning about how a heart can be poisoned by a memory until nothing else remains. A small plaque in the village square marks the date, listing the names of the 9 victims who were lost. It is a simple memorial, often surrounded by fresh flowers left by the descendants of the survivors. The silence of the village is no longer the silence of a secret, but the silence of a community that has finally moved past its darkest hour. The dry grass and the olive trees continue to grow, indifferent to the blood that was once spilled beneath their shadows so long ago. The smell of gunpowder eventually faded, replaced by the scent of dry grass and olive wood. The brothers were led away, and the village tried to breathe again. But in another corner of the globe, the humid air of Malaysia was vibrating with the sound of a rotary phone. A man was looking into a mirror at a new tattoo, preparing to challenge an entire nation with a different kind of violence, born not from an old feud, but from a new and deadly ego that felt invincible. Kalimuthu sat in a small, dimly lit shop in Kuala Lumpur, his arm resting on a scarred wooden table. The air was thick with the smell of cheap tobacco and antiseptic. He watched with a strange, detached fascination as the tattoo artist worked a needle into his skin. The sound was a low, electric hum that filled the room. He did not flinch when the ink went deep. He wanted the words to be permanent, a statement of his own dark destiny. The tattoo artist moved slowly, his own hands shaking slightly as he worked on the man everyone called Bentong Kali. He knew the reputation of the man sitting in the chair, a man who viewed a look of disrespect as a death sentence. He wiped away a small bead of blood and continued the lettering across Kali's chest. The words "born to die" began to take shape in dark, jagged ink. Kali looked in the mirror and felt a cold sense of completion. Kalimuthu grew up in the town of Bentong, a place surrounded by dense jungle and rubber plantations. As a young man, he was known for being quiet and observant, a person who never forgot a slight. He spent his time lifting weights and learning how to move through the city without being noticed. He didn't want a normal life of labor and quiet routine. He wanted to be the one who made the rules in every room he entered, no matter the cost. He started with small crimes, moving quickly through the ranks of local gangs by being more violent than anyone else expected. He found that fear was a more effective tool than money. In the early 1990s, He moved to the capital, Kuala Lumpur, and began to build a reputation that reached into every corner of the criminal underworld. He didn't just want to be a gangster, he wanted to be a legend, a name that people whispered with a shudder. Kali lived in various rented rooms across the city, never staying in one place for more than a few days. He was a man of discipline, waking up early to check his weapons and plan his movements. He liked to sit in small local cafes, drinking black coffee and watching the people go by. He felt superior to the office workers and shopkeepers who followed the law. To him, they were just sheep, and he was the one who decided which of them would be allowed. He was obsessed with his own physical presence, often spending hours in front of a mirror admiring his tattoos and his muscles. He believed that he was protected by supernatural forces, visiting local mystics and wearing charms that he believed would turn away bullets. This sense of invincibility made him increasingly reckless. He stopped hiding his face and began to operate in broad daylight, confident that no one would ever have the courage to testify. A local shopkeeper named Tan owned a small grocery store on a busy corner in the city. He was a man of simple habits, opening his shop at 6 in the morning and closing it late at night. He knew most of his customers by name and took pride in his service. He had heard the rumors about a man named Kali who was causing trouble in the district, but he didn't think much of it. To Tan, the world was a fair place where hard work was always rewarded with peace. Tan spent his days stacking cans of condensed milk and weighing out bags of rice for the neighborhood families. He was a kind man, often letting people pay later if they were short on cash. He enjoyed the small talk with his regulars and the sound of the traffic outside his door. His life was predictable and safe, a series of small, honest tasks that kept him grounded. He had no reason to believe that a simple request for payment would ever lead to anything. One humid afternoon, a dark car pulled up in front of Tan's shop, blocking the entrance for other customers. A man in a clean, pressed shirt stepped out and walked toward the counter. He didn't look like a criminal. He looked like a successful businessman. He asked for a pack of cigarettes and a cold drink, his voice calm and polite. Tan handed the items over and waited for the man to reach for his wallet, but the man just turned and began to walk away. Tan called out to the man, his voice firm but respectful. He asked the stranger to pay for the items, thinking perhaps he had just forgotten in the heat of the day. The man stopped and turned around slowly. There was no anger on his face, only a look of profound annoyance, as if a fly had landed on his sleeve. He walked back to the counter and looked Tan in the eye. The silence in the small shop became heavy, and the sound of the fan felt like a ticking clock. Without a word, the man reached into his waistband and pulled out a heavy, black handgun. He didn't hesitate or look around to see if anyone was watching. He fired a single shot into the air, the noise shattering the peace of the neighborhood. Then he looked at Tan and told him that his life was worth much more than a pack of cigarettes. He walked back to his car, leaving the shopkeeper trembling behind the counter. It was the sign that the rules had changed. A few days later, a body was found in a ditch on the outskirts of the city. It was a young man who had been reported missing after a minor disagreement at a local bar. He had been shot multiple times, and the police noted that the killer had made no attempt to hide the body. It was left in a way that ensured it would be found quickly. The ballistic reports showed that the weapon used was the same one that had been fired in the grocery store earlier that week. The city began to realize that they were dealing with someone who didn't follow the usual patterns of organized crime. This wasn't about drugs or territory, it was about ego. The police received a series of phone calls and letters from a man identifying himself as Bentong Kali. He taunted the investigators, telling them where he had been and what he planned to do next. He seemed to enjoy the attention, viewing the police as his own personal audience. The Royal Malaysian Police realized they could no longer treat Kali like a common criminal. They formed a high-level task force, bringing in the Special Action Unit, known as the UTK. These were elite officers trained in counterterrorism and high-stakes arrests. They began a systematic search of the city, focusing on the hidden rooms and safe houses where Kali was known to hide. The pressure was mounting, but Kali continued to slip through their fingers like a shadow. An investigator named Inspector Rahman spent his nights staring at a map of Kuala Lumpur, trying to find a pattern in the chaos. He noted that Kali seemed to strike whenever he felt slighted, no matter how small the offense. He was a man who lived in a state of constant, simmering resentment. Rahman realized that they weren't hunting a strategist. They were hunting a narcissist who couldn't stand to be ignored. The goal was to lead Kali into a trap. The police started to tighten the net around Kali's known associates, cutting off his access to money and transportation. They leaked information to the press that suggested Kali was a coward who was hiding from a fair fight. They knew this would provoke him, and they were right. Kali began to make more mistakes, calling the police station directly to scream at the officers and promise that he would show them his bravery. The game was reaching its final end. During one of these phone calls, the police managed to trace the signal to a specific neighborhood in the hills of Medan Damansara. It was an affluent area, with large houses and quiet, tree-lined streets. It was the last place anyone would expect to find the nation's most wanted killer. The tactical teams moved into position under the cover of a heavy tropical rainstorm, their dark uniforms blending into the shadows as they surrounded a large two-story house. Inside the house, Kali was sitting in front of a mirror, once again examining his tattoos. He felt the weight of the handgun on the table beside him, and the coldness of the floor beneath his feet. He knew the police were coming, but he didn't feel afraid. He believed his charms would protect him and that he would walk away from the encounter as a hero of the underworld. He poured himself a glass of water and waited for the sound of the door being kicked in. The detectives found a journal in one of Kali's previous hiding spots that revealed the depth of his obsession with the occult. He had written about how he had sacrificed animals to gain the power of invisibility and how the ink in his skin was mixed with ashes that made him bulletproof. This was why he was so bold. He didn't believe he could die. The police realized they weren't just fighting a man with a gun. They were fighting a man who had detached from reality. This belief in his own divinity was the key to his downfall. He didn't bother with a lookout or a secondary escape route because he truly thought he could walk through a wall of lead. He had convinced himself that the laws of nature did not apply to him. As the elite team prepared to breach the house, they knew that Kali would not surrender. He was waiting for a confrontation that would prove his legend, a final scene in a movie he had been writing in his head. The flashbang grenades detonated with a blinding light and a deafening roar, filling the house with thick, white smoke. The tactical team moved in with precision, their weapons drawn. Kali did not hide. He stood in the middle of the room and began to fire, shouting his own name as if it were a prayer. He moved toward the officers, his eyes wide and fixed on a vision only he could see. He expected the bullets to pass through him like mist, but reality was final. The exchange of gunfire lasted only a few seconds. The officers fired with the accuracy that came from months of training, and the man who believed he was invincible was thrown back against the wall. The sound of the weapons died down, leaving only the smell of gunpowder and the rhythmic dripping of water from a broken pipe. Kali lay on the floor, his eyes still open but the light within them fading fast. The legend of Bentong Kali ended on a cold, tiled floor. Kalamuthu was a man who had been consumed by his own narcissism. He had committed 17 murders in a span of just a few years, most of them for reasons that no one else could understand. He needed the world to fear him because he didn't know how to exist without that fear. He was a product of a culture of violence that he had taken to its absolute extreme, using his charisma to build a cult of personality that vanished the moment he was no longer standing. The investigation into his background showed a man who was deeply insecure, always seeking validation through acts of aggression. He had no loyalty to anyone but himself, frequently betraying his own gang members to stay one step ahead of the law. His tattoos and occult beliefs were a shield he built to hide a man who was terrified of being ordinary. In the end, he was just a violent criminal who had run out of luck and out of time in the rainy streets of the city. Even now, in 2026, P. Kalamuthu remains the most famous criminal in the history of Malaysia. His story is taught to every new police recruit as a case study in the psychology of the kamikaze criminal. He died in 1993, and his name is still used as a warning to those who think they can challenge the state through terror. The Born to Die tattoo became a self-fulfilling prophecy, a permanent mark on a body that has long since returned to the earth. The lead from the bullets that ended Cali's reign was cold and heavy, a material end to a violent life. But in another part of the world, a different kind of metal was being prepared. High explosive steel was being loaded into a stolen rocket in the ancient city of Athens. A group of ghosts was moving through the shadows, preparing a strike that would leave no signature and no survivors, turning the quiet morning of a diplomat into a crater of smoke and fire. You are standing on a street corner in a city where the silence feels heavy, waiting for a sound that you hope will never come. The air is still, but you can feel the tension in the way the lights flicker overhead. It is the kind of quiet that precedes a storm, a moment where the world seems to hold its breath before the metal hits the ground. We are moving now from the rainy streets of Kuala Lumpur to the ancient, shadowed alleys of the city of Athens. October 7th, 1991. Athens, Greece. Korolos Tsizik adjusted the collar of his coat as he stepped onto the sidewalk of a quiet residential street. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of roasted coffee and the faint, salty breeze from the Aegean Sea. He moved toward his parked Mercedes with the practiced caution of a man who knew his profession made him a target for the shadows. Korolos was a career diplomat, serving as the press attaché for the Turkish embassy. He was a man of routines and schedules, believing that order was the only defense against the growing tension in the city. He spent his days drafting official statements and navigating the complex political waters of the Mediterranean. To him, the office was a place of logic, even when the world outside felt increasingly chaotic and unpredictable. He lived in a comfortable apartment in a neighborhood where neighbors greeted each other with a nod and a polite word. Korolos enjoyed the simple pleasures of Greek life, the long lunches in sun-drenched tavernas, and the slow walks along the ancient stone paths of the city. He was a man who appreciated history, but he was also acutely aware that history in Athens was often written in blood and marked by the sound of sirens. His wife often watched him from the balcony as he left for work, a silent ritual of care and worry. They had built a life together that felt solid, even if it was lived in the shadow of international disputes and old grudges. Korolos would always look up and wave, a small gesture that meant he would see her again in the evening. To her, he was just a husband, not a symbol of a foreign power or a pawn in a larger game. In another part of the city, a man named Alexandros sat in a small, quiet cafe, sipping an espresso while reading the morning paper. He looked like any other middle-aged intellectual, with silver hair and a thoughtful expression. He lived on a remote island most of the year, claiming to be a translator and a writer. His neighbors thought he was a peaceful man who preferred the company of books to the noise of modern politics. Alexandros was a master of the invisible life. He shopped at the local market, paid his bills on time, and never raised his voice in a disagreement. He was the kind of person you would walk past 1,000 times without ever remembering his face. He valued the anonymity of the crowd, using it as a cloak to hide a set of beliefs that were far more radical than anyone around him could have ever imagined or truly understood. He moved through the streets of Athens with the confidence of someone who owned the shadows. To him, the city was a map of opportunities and tactical advantages. He didn't see diplomats or officers as people. He saw them as representatives of a system he was determined to dismantle. He spent his nights in a small, hidden room, typing manifestos on an old manual typewriter that had become the only voice of his secret and violent world. The group he led was called 17 November, named after a student uprising years earlier. They were a tiny cell, consisting mostly of family members and a few trusted friends who shared a bond of absolute silence. They didn't use phones or computers, preferring handwritten notes and face-to-face meetings in crowded parks. This lack of a digital footprint made them ghosts to the intelligence agencies that were trying to find them. For nearly 2 decades, they had committed assassinations and bombings in broad daylight, yet the police had never found a single witness who could provide a description. They would appear from nowhere, strike with military precision, and then vanish back into the ordinary lives they led as teachers, shopkeepers, and musicians. They were the neighbors you liked, the quiet people who always held the door open and smiled at your children. On that morning in 1991, Carolus reached his car and opened the heavy, armored door. He felt the weight of the metal, a reassurance that he was protected from the world outside. He settled into the leather seat and turned the key in the ignition, listening to the smooth hum of the engine. He didn't notice the white van parked just a few yards away, its side door slightly open and a long pipe pointing directly at him. A sudden, deafening roar tore through the quiet street, followed by a flash of light that turned the morning white. An anti-tank rocket, stolen months earlier from a military museum, struck the side of the Mercedes with incredible force. The armor plate, designed to stop bullets, was no match for a projectile meant to pierce a tank. The car was lifted off the ground and thrown against a stone wall, surrounded by a cloud of black and heavy smoke. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating, broken only by the sound of car alarms and the distant shouting of people running toward the scene. Carolus was gone in an instant, his routine and his future erased by a piece of metal launched from a shadow. The white van pulled away slowly, blending into the morning traffic as if it were just another delivery vehicle making its rounds in the busy and narrow streets of Athens. The police arrived within minutes, but they found nothing but the burning wreckage and a few scorched pieces of the rocket. There were no fingerprints, no discarded weapons, and no witnesses who could identify the attackers. It was a signature 17 November hit, clinical and cold. They had once again struck a high-profile target in the middle of a crowded city and vanished before the first siren could even be heard by the residents. A few hours later, a courier delivered a package to a local newspaper. Inside was a lengthy manifesto, typed on the group's signature manual typewriter. It claimed responsibility for the hit, citing Carolus as a target of imperialist aggression. The investigators looked at the letters, noting the specific way the ink faded on certain keys. It was the only physical evidence they had, a mechanical voice that mocked their inability to find the hands. The investigation into the group became the longest and most frustrating search in Greek history. The CIA, Scotland Yard, and the German intelligence services all sent teams to Athens to help, but they found a wall of silence that was impossible to breach. There were no informants within the group because there was no way to get close to them. They were a family, and they did not betray their own blood, no matter how much pressure the state applied. Thousands of people were interviewed, and hundreds of suspected militants were placed under surveillance, but the members of 17 November remained invisible. They continued their campaign, using rockets, bombs, and pistols to strike at the heart of the government. They were a phantom army that seemed to know exactly when the police were looking the other way. The frustration within the security forces grew to a breaking point for many years. I noticed that for 27 years, the group used the same 1960s typewriter for every single one of their public statements. It was a detail that pointed to a strange, disciplined obsession, a mechanical consistency that matched the way they carried out their violence. They were men of the past, using old tools to fight a modern war, yet they were always one step ahead of the most advanced technology the world could offer them at that time. The break in the case didn't come from a brilliant detective or a high-tech satellite. It came from a simple mistake on a summer night in 2002. A man named Savas was carrying a bomb near a port in Piraeus when it detonated prematurely in his hands. He survived the blast but was severely injured and captured by the police. For the first time in nearly 30 years, the authorities had a living member of the ghost group in their custody. Savas was not a career criminal. He was a soft-spoken painter of religious icons. His capture led the police to a series of safe houses filled with weapons, including the very typewriter that had been the group's only voice for decades. One by one, the members were identified. They were not the international terrorists the experts had imagined. They were brothers, cousins, and friends who had been living normal lives while killing in the shadows. The leader, Alexandros, was finally arrested on a remote island where he had been living under a false name for years. He was an intellectual, the son of a famous activist, who had spent his life orchestrating a secret war from the safety of his study. He denied everything, maintaining his persona of a peaceful translator, even as his own comrades began to testify against him in the face of overwhelming forensic evidence and the discovery of his hideouts. The trial was a surreal event, as the ghosts were finally given faces and names. The victims' families sat in the courtroom, looking at the ordinary men who had caused so much pain. The members of 17 November didn't look like monsters. They looked like the people you see every day on the bus or in the market. This was their greatest strength, the ability to be completely and utterly unremarkable in the eyes of the world around them for decades. The group had survived for so long because they never expanded, never recruited outside their small circle, and never sought wealth. They lived modestly, often working low-paying jobs to maintain their cover. They were driven by an ideology that had become a religion to them, a belief that they were the only ones who saw the truth. Once the first link in the chain was broken by the accident in Piraeus, the entire network unraveled in a matter of weeks. Alexandros and several others were sentenced to multiple life terms in a high-security prison. The group was officially disbanded, and the cycle of violence that had haunted Athens for a generation finally came to an end. The manual typewriter was placed in a police museum, a silent artifact of a time when the city was a playground for shadows. The ghosts had been caught, but the memory of their strikes remained a deep and permanent scar on the nation. As we enter 2026, most members remain in prison, including the leader Alexandros. The operational leader, Dimitris, is still a divisive figure, with his periodic hunger strikes often leading to protests and tension in the streets of Athens. The case is studied as the perfect example of how a small, disciplined cell can evade detection for decades by simply refusing to grow or change. They were the ultimate masters of the invisible and the quiet life. The sound of the typewriter has been replaced by the steady rhythm of traffic in the modern city, but the streets where the rockets hit still carry a lingering chill. The ghosts are gone, but the emptiness they left behind in the families of their victims is a permanent mark. It is a story of how a small, secret world can exist inside a normal one, waiting for the moment when a single mechanical click changes everything for a man walking toward his car. The heavy, metallic thud of a rocket hitting an armored car is a sound that defines the end of a diplomat's routine. It is a material failure, the moment where steel meets fire and everything evaporates. But that same sudden violence can happen on a much larger scale, where a parked car in a busy city holds a weight that is not meant for travel. We are leaving the shadowed alleys of Athens for the crowded, smoking streets of the city of Colombo. You are standing at a busy intersection where the air is thick with diesel fumes and the sound of horns. People are rushing to work, unaware that a single car parked on the curb is the center of a different kind of storm. The silence here is not the silence of a secret, but the silence that follows a blinding flash of white. We are moving now into the heart of a conflict where a minister's morning drive becomes a crater in the middle of a nation. March 2nd, 1991, Colombo, Sri Lanka. Ranjan Wijeratne stepped into the back seat of his armored Mercedes-Benz, his fingers brushing against the cold, dark leather. The morning sun was already beginning to heat the heavy pavement outside his official residence. He signaled to his driver with a sharp, practiced nod, and the door closed with a muffled mechanical thud that seemed to push the sounds of the humid city away from him. The interior of the car was a climate-controlled sanctuary, a quiet bubble isolated from the crowded chaos of the capital city. Ranjan checked his watch, a silver piece that glinted under the thick tinted glass of the side window. He began to organize a stack of papers on his lap, his expensive pen clicking rhythmically as the motorcade pulled out of the driveway and began its journey through the busy streets of the early morning commute. Ranjan was 57 years old and held the position of Minister of State for Defense. He was a man who lived his life in a series of calculated risks and high-stakes meetings that defined the era. Every morning started with the same strong cup of tea and a review of the security briefings that shaped the direction of the nation. He was the architect of a firm, unyielding policy toward the rebels, and he wore his authority like a suit of iron armor. His wife often watched him from the doorway of their home, her face a mask of quiet composure that hid a decade of constant, simmering worry. They shared a brief, silent breakfast, where the only sound was the clinking of silver spoons against white porcelain. Ranjan did not talk much about his work at home, preferring to keep his family life separate from the violent realities of the civil war that raged in the distant north of the island nation. To his children, he was a man of strict discipline and very few words, someone who valued education and hard work above all else in the world. He had spent many years managing vast tea plantations before entering politics, and he still carried the habits of a planter. He liked things to be orderly, predictable, and efficient. He believed that the strength of a man was measured by his ability to maintain absolute control in the face of mounting chaos. The office of the ministry was a place of heavy wooden desks and the constant shrill ringing of rotary telephones. Ranjan moved through the corridors with a brisk, athletic pace, his guards struggling to keep up with his long strides. He was a man who did not wait for things to happen. He made them happen with a stroke of a pen. His reputation for being tough and uncompromising had made him both respected by his allies and deeply hated by his enemies. He enjoyed the few moments of quiet he found in the back of the armored car between his many appointments. It was a rare time when no one could reach him, and he could think about the complex future of his country. He looked out at the street vendors and the school children walking along the dusty sidewalks, their colorful uniforms a bright contrast to the olive-drab military vehicles that patrolled the city streets in a constant, heavy rotation. Ranjan truly believed that he was making the world safer for those children, even if it meant making difficult and unpopular decisions on a daily basis. He had survived previous threats and close calls, which had only served to reinforce his sense of destiny. He felt as though he were a necessary part of the government machine, a component that could not be easily replaced or broken by the immense pressure of the long and exhausting ethnic conflict. As the motorcade moved through the Havelock Road area, Ranjan looked at a group of pigeons scattering into the air from a public square. He noticed the way the light hit their gray wings, a fleeting moment of beauty in a city that often felt like a tinderbox. He returned to his notes, underlining a specific name in red ink with a steady hand. The routine of his daily commute was a source of comfort, a predictable path through an unpredictable landscape. A white car was parked on the side of the road, its chassis sitting unusually low to the ground as if it were carrying a hidden weight. It was an older model sedan, the kind that was common in the streets of Colombo and rarely attracted a second glance from the passing security teams. The vehicle sat silently near a busy intersection, its windows tinted dark enough to hide whatever might be sitting on the rear seat or inside the cramped trunk space. Inside a building nearby, a man watched the approaching motorcade through a pair of powerful binoculars. He did not look like a soldier. He looked like an ordinary clerk waiting for a morning bus. His hand rested on a small plastic remote control that was connected to a series of wires hidden beneath his simple clothes. He waited for the specific glint of the lead Mercedes as it reached a pre-marked point on the dark asphalt of the intersection. The world suddenly turned into a blinding wall of white light and a roar that was felt in the bones before it was ever heard by the ears. The parked car vanished, replaced by a massive, expanding sphere of bright fire and jagged metal fragments. The 50 kilograms of high explosives acted with a chemical certainty, turning the surrounding air into a physical hammer that crushed everything in its immediate path with a force that was impossible to resist. The armored Mercedes was lifted completely off the ground and tossed aside like a toy, its heavy plates buckling under the immense pressure of the blast. The windows of the nearby shops shattered instantly, showering the street in a rain of glass needles. A thick, oily cloud of black smoke rose into the clear morning sky, visible from many miles away, as the sound of the massive explosion echoed across the entire capital of the island of Sri Lanka. The first responders arrived to find a scene of absolute devastation that did not seem to belong in a quiet residential neighborhood. A crater the size of a small swimming pool had been torn into the middle of the road, exposing the pipes beneath. The remains of the parked car were scattered over several city blocks, bits of scorched metal hanging from the branches of the trees like strange, dark fruit in the intense heat of the morning sunlight. Investigators moved through the smoking debris with meticulous care, wearing heavy leather boots to protect themselves from the sharp glass. They found that the bomb had been triggered with a sophisticated remote control device, the kind used by highly trained specialized units. The precision of the timing suggested that the killers had been tracking the minister's movements for weeks, learning every habit and every turn his motorcade ever made. They recovered a small piece of a circuit board that had somehow survived the intense heat of the massive explosion. It was a Silver Bell brand component, a common electronic item that was very difficult to trace back to a specific seller in the busy markets. The forensic team spent many days piecing together the fragments of the vehicle that held the bomb, trying to identify the original owner through a serial number that had been partially melted. The security teams realized that a second car had likely been used to scout the route ahead of the motorcade. This shadow car would have signaled the exact moment the minister's vehicle passed the parked bomb. The investigation turned toward the local garages and car rental agencies, looking for anyone who had recently purchased an older sedan and modified it to carry a heavy and dangerous load of industrial explosives without being detected by others. Every witness who had been near the busy intersection was brought in for questioning, but most could only describe a sudden flash and the sound of a thunderclap. The trauma of the event had erased the smaller details from their memories almost instantly. The police focused on the few seconds before the blast, looking for any person who seemed out of place or was seen using an electronic device in a nearby building overlooking the main road. A breakthrough came when a technician realized the explosives were not commercial grade, but a specific military mixture used by the rebel groups in the north. This was not a random act of terror or a personal grudge between politicians. It was a surgical strike carried out by a specialized cell known for their ability to infiltrate the highest levels of government security. The killers were already many miles away before the smoke had even cleared. The investigation revealed that the information about the minister's route had likely been leaked from within his own inner circle of staff. The attackers knew exactly which car he would be in and what time he would pass the intersection near the school. The armored protection that Ranjan trusted had been turned against him, as the heavy plates of the Mercedes acted like a pressure cooker once the blast breached the main structure of the heavy vehicle. The identification of the bomb-making cell led the police to a small safe house in the suburbs of the city. By the time they kicked in the door, the rooms were empty, save for a few discarded wires and the lingering smell of chemicals. The killers had moved like ghosts, leaving behind no fingerprints and no physical clues that could lead to their capture. They had completed their mission and vanished back into the vast and growing chaos of the Civil War. 18 people lost their lives in the explosion, including the minister, his entire security detail, and several innocent civilians who were just on their way to work or school. The scale of the attack showed that the city was no longer a safe haven from the ethnic conflict. The total war that Ranjan had advocated for had arrived at his own doorstep, delivered with a cold and calculated efficiency that shocked the entire nation and the international community. The group responsible was the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, specifically their elite suicide and sabotage unit. They were a movement that valued absolute loyalty and spent many months rehearsing their attacks using scale models of the target areas. They did not view themselves as criminals, but as soldiers in a desperate struggle for a homeland. Their patience and their willingness to wait for the perfect moment made them nearly impossible to stop. They used a cellular structure where each member only knew the person directly above them in the hierarchy. If one person was caught, the rest of the chain remained hidden and operational. This was why the investigation into the shadow car eventually hit a dead end in the capital. The people who bought the vehicle, the people who built the bomb, and the person who pressed the button were all separate components of a machine designed to be invisible. The elite bomb makers often spent their time in high-security hideouts, experimenting with different triggers and explosive combinations. They were technicians of death, focused on the physics of destruction. To them, the assassination was a problem of timing and weight. They studied the thickness of the Mercedes armor and calculated the exact amount of force needed to penetrate it. They were clinical in their approach, showing no emotion for the people involved. Standing at this busy intersection in 2026, the site of the explosion is a busy, modern intersection in Colombo. The crater was filled in decades ago, and the buildings that were damaged have all been rebuilt and repainted. Ranjan Wijeratne is remembered as a controversial figure who stood at the center of a very violent era in his nation's history. The group that killed him was defeated in 2009, ending the long and bloody civil war that had claimed so many lives. The case is officially considered closed, though the individual members of the specific bomb cell were never brought to a traditional courtroom to face their crimes. Most of them were lost in the final brutal stages of the conflict many years later. In 2026, the event is still studied in military academies as a classic example of asymmetric warfare and the failure of conventional armored protection against a high-yield improvised explosive device. The legacy of the bombing led to a complete overhaul of how high-ranking officials were transported in the city. The armored cars became heavier, the motorcades became larger, and the routes were changed every single day. But the event had already proven that no amount of steel can protect a man from a shadow that has already learned his routine. The air in Colombo remains humid and heavy, but the sound of that specific morning is still a part of the city. The government eventually erected a small memorial for the victims, though it is often overlooked by the thousands of people who pass by it every hour. The names are etched in stone, but the stories behind them have faded into the larger narrative of the war. For the families of the bystanders who were lost, the intersection is not just a place on a map. It is the exact point where their lives were forever altered by a conflict they did not choose. The silver bell component that was found in the debris became a symbol of the mundane nature of terror. It was a simple, cheap part that could be found in any radio or television set, yet it had been used to end the life of one of the most powerful men in the country. It showed that the tools of destruction were everywhere, hidden in plain sight among the ordinary objects of daily life. The killers understood this better than the security forces ever did. I have often reflected on how a city's routine can evaporate in a single second, leaving only the smell of ozone and the sound of a distant siren. The routine of a minister's morning drive was a thin shield against a world that had already decided his fate. That same sudden silence is waiting in the early morning air of a Nigerian prison yard where 69 men are standing in a row, their shadows long against the salt-stained earth of the coast. The heavy metallic thud of a rocket or a bomb is a sound that defines the end of a long routine. It is a material failure, the moment where steel meets fire and everything evaporates into smoke. But that same sudden violence can happen on a much larger scale, where the government itself becomes the hand that pulls the trigger. We are leaving the smoking streets of Colombo for the cold, disciplined dawn of a military compound in the city of Lagos. April 22nd, 1990. Lagos, Nigeria. Major Gideon Orkar adjusted his heavy military beret in the rearview mirror of a parked jeep. The early morning air was thick with the smell of diesel fumes and the salt spray from the nearby Atlantic coast. He checked the time on his watch, waiting for the signal to move toward the gates of the Federal Radio Corporation. Everything in the city was still, but the silence felt brittle and ready to break at any moment. Gideon was 37 years old and had spent his entire adult life inside the disciplined world of the Nigerian army. He was a man of sharp angles and even sharper convictions, known among his peers for his intellect and his deep frustration with the corruption he saw in the upper ranks of the government. He believed that a soldier's true duty was to protect the integrity of the nation, even if it meant turning his weapon against those who were in power. He had grown up in a family that valued service and education, and he had risen through the ranks by being more dedicated and more meticulous than anyone else in his unit. Gideon was a man who preferred the company of books and maps to the noisy social life of the officers' club. He spent his evenings studying political history and economic theory, trying to find a way to fix the structural problems that he felt were tearing his country apart from the inside for years. To his fellow officers, he was a leader who led by example, never asking a subordinate to do something he would not do himself. He was the kind of man who remembered the names of his soldiers' children and made sure their families were taken care of when they were away on duty. This personal loyalty was the foundation of the secret network he had spent many months building. A group of young, idealistic officers who were tired of the status quo and ready for a change. Gideon's planning was exhaustive and quiet. He held meetings in dimly lit corners of the barracks and shared coded messages through trusted couriers. He did not want a long, bloody civil war. He wanted a surgical strike that would remove the military dictator, General Babangida, and reset the nation's course. He spent hours tracing the blueprints of the presidential residence, known as Dodan Barracks, memorizing every guard post and every possible exit for his small team. The night before the move, Gideon sat in his quarters and wrote a final letter to his family. He did not speak of glory or power, only of his hope for a Nigeria where a man's future was not decided by his ethnicity or his connections to the ruling elite. He folded the paper carefully and tucked it into a small wooden box, aware that he might never see his home again. The weight of his decision was heavy, but he felt a strange sense of calm as the dawn approached. His quarters were sparse, containing only his uniforms, a few books, and a small radio. Gideon was a man of simple needs, and he had always been more concerned with the welfare of his soldiers than with his own comfort. He often shared his rations with those who had less, and he was known for his habit of listening to the grievances of the lower-ranking men. This empathy made him a dangerous figure to the establishment, as it gave him a power that rank alone could not provide. At exactly 4 a.m, the silence of Lagos was shattered by the rhythmic thud of heavy boots on pavement and the roar of armored personnel carriers. Gideon led his team into the radio station, and within minutes, the broadcast towers were under his control. He stepped up to the microphone, his voice steady and low, and announced to the sleeping city that the government had been toppled. Outside, the first shells were already hitting the gates of the Dodan barracks. The speech was long and detailed, outlining a list of grievances that ranged from economic mismanagement to the marginalization of certain states. Gideon spoke with the authority of a man who believed he was the voice of the people. In the streets, people woke up to the sound of his words, some with hope and others with a deep, paralyzing fear of what the morning would bring. The city held its breath as the sound of distant gunfire began to echo across the lagoon. Inside the presidential residence, the chaos was absolute. Smoke filled the hallways as Gideon's men fought their way through the elite guards who remained loyal to the regime. But the one man they needed was no longer there. General Babangida had been alerted just minutes before the perimeter was breached and had managed to escape through a small, inconspicuous side door that led to a waiting car. The surgical strike had missed the heart of the target by a few seconds. By midday, the Loyalist troops had regrouped and were moving into the city with an overwhelming force. Gideon realized that the support he had been promised by other military units across the country was not coming. He watched from the windows of the radio station as his men were surrounded, one by one. There was no grand final battle, only the slow, systematic closing of a heavy trap. He was arrested in the early afternoon, his uniform torn and dusty in the sun. What followed was a cold and clinical purge of the military ranks that lasted for weeks. The state did not want a public spectacle, so they held the trials in secret military tribunals behind the high concrete walls of the barracks. Gideon and his fellow officers were brought before a panel of senior generals who had already decided on the outcome. There were no lawyers and no cameras, only the scratching of pens on paper and the low, muffled voices of the men in the room. The investigators moved through the army like a cold blade, looking for anyone who might have known about the plot. They did not just arrest the leaders. They picked up junior officers, drivers, and even administrative staff who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The scale of the betrayal within the military was deeper than the government had ever imagined, and the response was designed to ensure that no one would ever dare to dream of a coup again. The interrogation rooms were windowless and humid, smelling of old sweat and floor wax. Gideon sat in a hard wooden chair, refusing to provide the names of the civilians who had supported the movement. He maintained his composure even as the officers across from him grew increasingly frustrated. To him, the failure of the coup was a tactical error, not a moral one. He viewed his captors as the true criminals, men who had sold the soul of the country for personal gain. As the weeks passed, the number of men in custody grew to nearly 70. Many of them were young soldiers who had simply followed the orders of their superiors on that April morning, unaware of the larger political goals. They sat in the crowded cells of Kirikiri prison, listening to the waves hitting the coast and waiting for a word that never came. The state viewed them all as a single, collective threat that needed to be permanently removed to restore total order. The prison was a place of gray stone and rusted iron, where the passage of time was marked only by the arrival of meager meals. The men spent their days in silence, reflecting on the choices that had led them to this point. Some prayed, while others stared at the small patches of sky they could see through the barred windows. There was no talk of rescue or escape. They all knew the nature of the system they had tried to overthrow and the price of their failure. One young soldier, who had only been in the army for a year, spent his time writing poems on the backs of old cigarette packs. He wrote about the village he had left behind and the mother who was still waiting for his return. He did not understand the politics of the coup, only that his major had told him it was time to move. He was a casualty of a conflict he barely understood, a small part of a much larger machine that was now preparing to grind him into the dust. July 27th, 1990. The sun rose over Kirikiri prison, casting long, sharp shadows across the dirt yard. 69 men were led out in small groups, their hands tied behind their backs with heavy abrasive rope. They were taken to a row of wooden stakes that had been driven into the salt-stained earth near the water. The air was thick with the smell of the nearby ocean, and the heavy scent of diesel from the military trucks that lined the perimeter. Gideon was in the final group to be let out. He walked with his head held high, looking at the row of men who stood beside him in the morning light. There were no speeches allowed, and no final words for the public. The only sound in the yard was the rhythmic clatter of the firing squad's rifles as they were loaded and the distant chirping of birds in the trees. The soldiers of the state moved with a mechanical precision, their faces hidden behind dark glasses in the sun. I noticed a detail in the official records about the final moments of the men. Just before the command was given to fire, a low, melodic sound began to rise from the row of stakes. The men were singing hymns together, their voices blending into a single, steady chord that even the firing squad could not fully ignore. It was a moment of human grace in a place that had been built for the opposite, a sound that lingered in the air long after the dust had finally settled. The killer in this story was not a single person, but the cold machinery of a state that had decided survival was more important than justice. The execution was carried out with a clinical efficiency that left no room for error. The command was given, and the sound of the rifles filled the air for several minutes, a repetitive, heavy noise that echoed off the prison walls. When it was over, the silence that returned to the yard was absolute and felt very final to the witnesses. The bodies were removed quickly and buried in unmarked graves in a location that remains a state secret to this day. The government issued a short, formal statement announcing that the traitors had been handled, and then they moved on as if the morning of April 22nd had never happened. The families were never given the chance to say goodbye or to claim the remains of their sons and husbands, leaving a void that would never be filled in their lives or homes. Gideon's wooden box, containing his last letter, was never found by his family. It likely sat in an evidence locker for years before being destroyed or lost in the bureaucracy of the military. His words, intended for his children, vanished along with the man who wrote them. The state had not just taken his life, they had taken his voice and his history, ensuring that his version of the story would remain buried beneath the layers of official reports and government silence. The aftermath of the executions left the military in a state of shock. The senior officers who had carried out the orders felt the weight of the decision, and a sense of unease settled over the barracks. The purge had been successful in removing the immediate threat, but it had also hollowed out the heart of the army. The trust that Gideon had valued so much was gone, replaced by a culture of suspicion and fear that would take another decade to even begin to fade away. In the democratic context of 2026, the Orkar coup is a mandatory subject in Nigerian military academies, though the perspective has changed over the decades. It is seen as a turning point that eventually led to the return of civilian rule, as the public grew tired of the constant cycle of military violence. Gideon Orkar is a figure of intense debate, viewed by some as a martyr for a better nation, and by others as a dangerous rebel who nearly sparked a civil war in the country. The Kirikiri prison yard is still in use, but the stakes are gone, and the ground has been covered with a thick layer of concrete. The 69 men are officially listed in historical archives, but their burial site remains one of the country's greatest mysteries. In 2026, Nigeria is a democracy, but the shadows of the military era still linger in the way the laws are written and the way the government handles dissent in the modern cities and the rural states. The families of the 69 men still meet once a year to light candles and remember their lost loved ones. They do not have a grave to visit, so they gather near the coast and look out at the water, which is the only thing that remains the same since 1990. They share stories of the men as they were as fathers, brothers, and sons, refusing to let the state's definition of them as traitors be the final word on their lives and their individual characters. Gideon's legacy is preserved in the whispered conversations of those who still dream of a different kind of leadership. He is a reminder of the cost of idealism in a world that often values order above all else. His story is taught not just as a lesson in military history, but as a study in the limits of force and the enduring power of a single, well-spoken conviction. The sound of the hymns in the prison yard is a part of the national myth, a song that will not end. The silence of the unmarked graves is a heavy part of the national memory, a space where the official history and the private grief of the people meet and clash. The country continues to move forward, but it carries the weight of 1990 with it, a reminder of what happens when the dialogue between the state and its people is replaced by the sound of rifles. The salt air continues to blow over the coast, indifferent to the secrets it holds. The salt air from the Lagos coast eventually cleared the smell of gunpowder from the prison yard. The state's order was restored, and the files were closed. But that same cold, state-sponsored violence was happening thousands of miles away in the city of Lima, where a neighborhood barbecue was about to be interrupted by a group of men in white vans. The music was playing, and the children were laughing, unaware that they had already been marked by a different squad. You are standing in a small yard in Barrios Altos, where the smell of grilled meat is thick in the air. A child is running between the tables, his laughter competing with the loud salsa music playing from a nearby radio. The sun is setting, and the neighborhood feels like a safe, warm pocket of humanity in a city that is often cold and indifferent. You can feel the vibration of two white vans pulling up to the curb, their engines idling in a way that sounds like a warning. The transition from a celebration to a tragedy happens in the space of a single heartbeat. The music continues to play, but the rhythm of the evening has shifted into something jagged and sharp. We are moving now from the disciplined dawn of Lagos to the chaotic, blood-stained night of a party in Lima. It is a story of how the state's desire for control can lead it into the most ordinary of places, looking for enemies among the innocent and the young. November 3rd, 1991, Barrios Altos, Lima. 8-year-old Javier Rios Rojas was helping his father, Manuel, move a heavy wooden table into the center of the courtyard. The air carried the sharp, savory scent of chicken skin crisping over hot charcoal. Javier grabbed the edge of the splintered wood and pulled, his small sneakers squeaking against the damp concrete as he maneuvered the table past a group of neighbors who were already beginning to dance. Javier was a small, energetic boy who loved the communal atmosphere of the Barrios Altos district. He spent his afternoons playing soccer in the narrow alleys with his friends, his laughter echoing off the faded stone walls of the old colonial buildings. To him, the courtyard was the center of the world, a place where families shared their lives and their meals without a second thought. He felt completely at home among the people he had known since he was a baby. Manuel worked hard as a street vendor, selling small goods to provide a stable life for his son. He was a man of quiet habits, known for his kindness and his willingness to help a neighbor in need. On this particular Sunday, he had organized a small fundraising party to repair the building's leaking roof. He moved through the courtyard with a steady pace, greeting everyone with a tired but genuine smile. He wanted his son to grow up in a place that was well cared for. The residents of the building were working-class people who had lived in the district for generations. They were shoe shiners, ice cream vendors, and laborers who valued the tight-knit nature of their community. In a city often divided by wealth and politics, the courtyard was a neutral ground where only friendship mattered. They shared a common history and a common hope for a peaceful future for their children, moving with a familiarity that only comes from years of proximity. Javier's mother was in the kitchen, preparing a large pot of traditional Peruvian stew. The sound of her humming blended with the clink of silverware and the chatter of the guests as they began to arrive. She took pride in her cooking, knowing that a good meal could bring people together like nothing else. The kitchen was warm and smelled of cumin and garlic, a sensory map of the family's simple but happy life. She moved between the stove and the table with practiced ease. The music was loud and celebratory, drowning out the distant noise of the city traffic. People were dancing in the small, open spaces between the tables, their shadows moving against the walls. It was a moment of pure, ordinary joy, a break from the long hours of work that defined their weekly routine. Javier ran between the adults, grabbing a piece of bread and dodging the swaying couples with a practiced ease, his mind focused entirely on the fun of the current moment. One neighbor, a retired shoemaker named Filomeno, sat in the corner with a glass of soda, watching the younger generation with a look of quiet satisfaction. He had seen many changes in Lima over the decades, but the spirit of Barrios Altos remained the same. To him, the neighborhood was a family, and every person in the courtyard was a part of his own history. He adjusted his glasses and took a slow, methodical sip of his drink, enjoying the cool night air on his face. As the evening progressed, the party reached its peak. The fundraising goal was nearly met, and the atmosphere was one of shared achievement. Manuel took a moment to sit down and watch his son play, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the life they had built together. The courtyard was a sanctuary, a place where the troubles of the outside world felt distant and manageable under the clear, dark sky. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for just a second. Javier found a discarded party hat and placed it on his head, making his father laugh. He felt safe and loved, surrounded by the people who knew his name and his stories. The world felt small and predictable, governed by the rhythm of the music and the warmth of the community. He didn't have any worries about the coming week, only the immediate pleasure of the celebration and the presence of his father. He sat down on the ground to adjust his sneakers for the next game. At approximately 10:30 in the evening, two white vans pulled up to the curb just outside the entrance of the building. The engines remained running, a low, mechanical hum that was barely audible over the music. Several men stepped out of the vehicles, their faces obscured by balaclavas and their movements disciplined and fast. They carried submachine guns, equipped with long, black cylinders on the barrels. They did not speak as they moved toward the open metal gate. The men did not hesitate at the gate. They moved in a tight formation, their boots making a heavy, synchronized sound on the pavement as they entered the courtyard. They did not shout orders or identify themselves as police or military. They simply appeared from the shadows of the street, their presence a sudden and jarring contrast to the colorful decorations and the lighthearted mood of the party. They fanned out across the open space, cutting off every possible exit for the guests. Manuel stood up from his chair, his brow furrowed in confusion. He thought at first that it might be a police raid looking for someone in the neighborhood, but the men did not look like the regular patrol officers he was used to seeing. They moved with a clinical silence that was far more unnerving than a loud intrusion. The music continued to play, but the dancing stopped as the residents realized they were no longer alone in the dark. He looked toward his son with a sudden fear. One of the masked men stepped forward and signaled for everyone to lie down on the cold concrete floor. The command was given with a hand gesture, not a word. The residents complied out of a deep, instinctive fear, their bodies pressing against the spilled soda and the discarded paper plates. Javier huddled close to his father, the party hat slipping from his head as he felt the sudden, icy shift in the room's temperature. Everything was suddenly very quiet in the building. The silence in the courtyard was now absolute, broken only by the scratching of the record needle at the end of a song. The masked men spread out, circling the people on the floor with their weapons held at the ready. They did not look for identification or ask any questions about who was present. They acted as if they already knew everything they needed to know about the people lying at their feet in the dark, their movements sharp and without any hesitation or wasted motion. Manuel kept his arm around Javier's shoulders, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. He could see the polished black boots of the men moving slowly past his head. He tried to remain as still as possible, hoping that this was just a mistake or a brief interrogation that would end quickly. He watched a single drop of condensation fall from a nearby water pipe, the sound of it hitting the ground, feeling like a drumbeat. He prayed that the intruders would leave the boy alone. The subsequent investigation would reveal that the men were members of a secret death squad known as Grupo Colina. This unit was comprised of intelligence officers and soldiers who had been trained for specialized, high-stakes operations. They operated outside the traditional chain of command, reporting to the highest levels of the government. Their mission was to eliminate individuals suspected of being members of insurgent groups, operating with total and absolute impunity. Forensic teams later examined the scene and found dozens of spent shell casings littering the floor of the courtyard. The weapons used were equipped with suppressors, which explained why the neighbors in the surrounding buildings hadn't heard the typical noise of a large-scale engagement. The operation had been carried out with a level of professional efficiency that suggested the men had rehearsed the entry and the exit many times before they ever arrived at the district. The government's initial public statement claimed that the event was a clash between rival terrorist factions. They suggested that the people at the party were high-ranking members of the Shining Path, a Maoist insurgent group that had been terrorizing the country for a decade. This narrative was used to justify the violence and to discourage the press from looking too closely at the details of the specific individuals involved. They tried to frame the victims as the enemy. Human rights lawyers and independent journalists began to dig deeper into the lives of the 15 people who had been lost that night. They interviewed the surviving relatives and searched through employment records and school enrollments. They found no evidence that any of the victims had ever been involved in political militancy or illegal activities. They were exactly who they appeared to be: laborers, vendors, and one small child who had no part in the national conflict. The paper trail eventually led to a series of secret orders issued from the National Intelligence Service. These documents revealed that the surveillance on the building had been flawed from the very beginning. An informant had wrongly identified the address as a safe house for a terrorist cell. Based on this single unverified tip, the death squad had been authorized to move in and eliminate everyone present without any further verification of the people who actually lived there. The investigators also found that the white vans used in the attack were registered to a government agency. This was a critical piece of evidence that linked the state directly to the crime. It showed that the clash was actually a coordinated execution carried out by the government's own security apparatus. The silence of the suppressed weapons was matched by the silence of the official reports that tried to bury the truth under a layer of administrative lies and legal jargon. The most significant break in the case came when a former member of Grupo Colina decided to speak out about his experiences. He described the internal culture of the squad, where the members were encouraged to view their targets as subhuman and their actions as a necessary part of a cleanup operation. He admitted that they knew within minutes of entering the courtyard that they were looking at innocent civilians who were not a threat. They were ordered to proceed anyway. This testimony changed the public's understanding of the conflict in Peru. It was no longer a simple story of the state fighting against terrorism. It was a story of a government that had lost its moral compass, using the same violent methods as the insurgents it claimed to be fighting. The victims of Barrios Altos became a symbol of the thousands of innocent people caught in the crossfire of a war that had no clear boundaries, a war that had entered their own private homes. The realization that an 8-year-old boy had been targeted as a terrorist was the detail that finally broke the state's narrative. It was impossible to justify the execution of a child with any political or military logic. The party hat found on the blood-stained floor became a powerful image that haunted the nation. A reminder of the ordinary life that had been discarded in the pursuit of an invisible and incorrectly identified enemy. The image was printed in every major newspaper. The legal battle to bring the perpetrators to justice lasted for nearly 2 decades. The government passed amnesty laws to protect the members of the death squad, and the case was repeatedly dismissed by the courts. But the families of the victims refused to give up. taking their fight all the way to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. They spent their lives in courtrooms, carrying the photos of their lost relatives in a silent and persistent protest for the world to see. In 2009, a historic verdict was reached. The former president of Peru, Alberto Fujimori, was found guilty of ordering the Barrios Altos massacre and was sentenced to 25 years in prison. It was the first time a democratically elected head of state had been convicted in his own country for crimes against humanity. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the names of the 15 victims, including 8-year-old Javier Rios Rojas, into the official record. The truth was finally clear. The massacre was not a mistake of the heat of battle, but a calculated and cold execution authorized at the highest level. The state had used its power to kill its own citizens based on a lie, and then spent years trying to hide the evidence. The Grupo Colina members were not acting on their own. They were the physical hands of a policy that valued a body count over the lives of the people it was sworn to protect. The lie had finally been dismantled. The survivors finally had the official recognition they had been seeking for so long. They were not terrorists, and their families were not criminals. The heavy weight of the state's accusation was finally lifted. Though it could not bring back the people who were lost in the courtyard, the legal victory was a form of closure, a declaration that the lives of the people in Barrios Altos had value, and that their history would be remembered accurately by future generations of the city. The members of Grupo Colina were highly decorated soldiers who believed they were heroes. They were men of discipline and order, trained to follow instructions without question. This specific mindset is what made them so dangerous. They were able to disconnect their actions from their own morality. After the trial, they were stripped of their ranks and sent to prison. Their legacy changed from defenders of the nation to executors of a child who was only celebrating a party. Alberto Fujimori died in September 2024, still serving his sentence under house arrest due to his failing health. Today, the Barrios Altos Memorial stands as a site of national pilgrimage for those who value human rights and the truth. The victims' families continue to be the face of the movement for justice in Peru, ensuring that the mistakes of the 1990s are never repeated by the government in the modern era or any other time. The music in the courtyard has long since stopped, and the white vans have been scrapped for metal. But the silence that follows a story like this is never truly empty. It is a silence filled with the memory of a party that never finished and a boy who just wanted to play. As you settle into the quiet of the night, remember that the smallest detail can be the most important, and the truth is often found in the things that were meant to be hidden from the eyes of the world. The world of the 90s changed, but the nature of darkness remained. Whether it was a killer in a Florida apartment or a death squad in Lima, they all left a void that time could never fill.